Amelia Whitmore did not cry when her stepmother pushed the suitcase into her hands. She had used up every tear she owned years ago, sometime between the night her father was buried and the morning she woke to find her bedroom door had been given a lock from the outside. She was 19 years old, standing in the middle of Raven Creek's town square in the Montana wind, and the woman who had controlled every breath she took for 6 years was smiling at a stranger and saying, "She's your problem now." If this story already has your heart, hit that subscribe button and follow along until the very end, because what happens next will stay with you. Drop the name of your city in the comments so I can see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The coins hit the dirt before anyone said a word. Elias Vance had set them there himself, dropped them flat into the dust at Margaret Whitmore's feet, and then he took one step back and looked at the woman the way a man looks at something he does not intend to touch. The morning light was thin and cold, the way Montana mornings always were in early April, and every person standing around the edges of Raven Creek's main square had gone quiet so fast it was like the wind itself had held its breath. Margaret stared at the coins. Then she looked up at him. "That is the agreed sum," she said, and her voice had that particular quality it always carried, smooth on the surface, with something mean, hiding just beneath it, the way ice looks solid until you step on it. "We discussed the arrangement. You take the girl, I receive compensation for the years I spent raising her. It's a fair exchange." Elias Vance did not move. He was not a tall man, not in the way that made people look twice for ordinary reasons. He was tall in the way that made people step back without quite knowing why they'd done it. He had a damaged leg that made him walk with a slight drag, a scar that ran from his left ear down along the jaw, and a face that had been weathered by years of mountain wind until it looked like something carved rather than born. He wore a dark coat and no expression whatsoever. "It isn't a fair exchange," he said. His voice was quiet. That was the thing people who had never met Elias Vance didn't understand. He never raised it. He never had to. "What you just described is a sale. I don't purchase people, Mrs. Whitmore. I never have, and I don't intend to start." Margaret's face tightened. "You agreed to take her in. You signed the paper. I agreed to offer her a place to work and a roof over her head in exchange for honest labor. That's a contract between two willing parties." He turned his head then just slightly and looked directly at Amelia for the first time since he'd arrived. "The girl signs it herself. Nobody signs it for her." Amelia had been standing 6 feet to her stepmother's left, holding a suitcase that was too heavy for one hand and too worn to be worth carrying, and she had been so still for so long that she had almost started to feel like part of the scenery. She was used to that. Being scenery was something she had learned over 6 years of practice. You stand quietly. You take up as little space as possible. You do not draw attention to yourself, because attention in Margaret Whitmore's house was never the kind that felt good. But now this man was looking at her. Not the way men in Raven Creek usually looked at her, with that particular mixture of pity and dismissal that she had come to recognize as the town's default expression whenever the Whitmore girl was mentioned. He was looking at her the way a person looks at another person, when they are genuinely trying to understand what that person is thinking. It was so unfamiliar that for a moment she forgot to breathe. "You get a say in this," Elias said to her, only to her, as if Margaret and the watching townspeople and the cold Montana morning had all ceased to exist. "I want to make that clear before anything else happens. You are not obligated. You are not purchased. You are not bound. If you want to walk in another direction, you walk. Is that understood?" Amelia's throat was very tight. She made herself nod. "I need to hear you say it," he said, not unkindly. "Just so we're both clear." "I understand," she said. Her voice came out smaller than she wanted it to. It always did. "Good." He picked up his hat from where he'd rested it against his knee and settled it back onto his head. Then he looked at Margaret one more time. "Pick up your coins, Mrs. Whitmore. You'll find I don't do business the way you're accustomed to." He turned and walked toward the wagon he'd left at the edge of the square. After a moment, Amelia picked up her suitcase and followed him. She did not look back at her stepmother. She had been looking back at Margaret Whitmore for 6 years, waiting for something to change, waiting for some sign that the woman saw her as more than an inconvenience left over from her father's first life. She was done waiting for that. She didn't know yet what she was walking toward, but she had spent long enough standing in a place she was not wanted. Behind her, she heard someone in the crowd say something under their breath. She caught the word dangerous. She caught the word scarred. She heard a woman near the dry goods store say to her companion in that carrying whisper people use when they want to be heard, "Poor thing, bad enough to be thrown out, worse to end up with him." Amelia kept walking. She had heard the stories about Elias Vance the same as everyone else in Raven Creek. You could not grow up in this town and not hear them. He had appeared in the valley roughly 7 years ago, bought land in the mountains that nobody else wanted, and kept to himself so completely that his presence was more rumor than reality to most people. The rumors were not kind. They said he had killed men during the war, more than a soldier was supposed to, more than could be explained by duty alone. They said the scar on his face was not from battle, but from something worse. They said animals behaved strangely around him, that his land was cursed, that the reason he lived alone up there in the pine forest was because no human being could tolerate him for long. Children dared each other to run past the turnoff to his road. Mothers used his name the way they used the dark as a reason to come inside. Amelia had believed most of it. She was not sure she had a reason not to, but then she thought about the coins in the dust. She thought about the way he had stepped back from her stepmother as if proximity to that particular transaction was something he found genuinely offensive. She thought about the word sale and the flat, quiet way he had said it, and the look on his face when he said it, not angry exactly. More like a man who has seen a thing done wrong so many times that the wrongness of it no longer surprises him, but never quite stops bothering him either. She climbed up onto the wagon seat when he stopped beside it and waited, and she settled her suitcase on her lap because there was nowhere else to put it. He climbed up on the other side, gathered the reins, and clicked his tongue at the horses. They moved. The town of Raven Creek passed away behind them, and neither of them said anything for a long time. It was Amelia who spoke first. She surprised herself. "How far is it?" she asked. 4 hours in good weather." He kept his eyes on the road. "Weather looks all right today." She looked at her hands. "I should tell you something." "If you want to." "I'm not—" She stopped. Started again. "Margaret told you I'm experienced with ranch work. I'm not. I've done household work. Cooking, cleaning, some mending. I've never worked with livestock. I don't know anything about cattle." A pause. "I know," he said. She looked at him. "You know, Mrs. Whitmore is not what I would call a forthcoming woman, but she's not difficult to read if you've had practice reading people who are trying to get the better of you." He didn't look at her. "I didn't bring you up there to run my cattle operation, Miss Whitmore. I have a man who does that. I brought you up there because—" He paused, seemed to be choosing words with some care. "Because you needed a place, and I have one." Amelia did not know what to do with that sentence. It was too simple. It did not have any of the conditions, or qualifications, or unspoken debts that sentences about her situation usually carried. It just sat there plain and complete. "I'll work," she said, because it was the only response she knew how to give. "Whatever needs doing, I'll do it. I don't want charity." "It isn't charity if you earn it." He glanced at her, then briefly, and then back at the road. "Fair wages, fair hours, your own space. We'll work out the specifics when we get there." "Why?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. The horses moved steadily. The road climbed. The air began to smell different, denser, richer the way mountain air always does when the pines start closing in. "My wife died," he said finally. 7 years ago. The house has needed a great many things since then that I have not known how to provide." He said it plainly without looking for sympathy. "I am not offering you a family, Miss Whitmore. I want to be clear about that. I'm offering you a position and a place to sleep that isn't dependent on someone's goodwill. Those are two different things." "I know the difference," Amelia said. I expect you do. She had known the difference since she was 13 years old. Her father, Thomas Whitmore, had been a good man in the ways that matter, and a careless one in the ways that destroy things. He had loved her sincerely and completely, and had nevertheless married Margaret Carr 14 months after her mother's death, reassuring Amelia with the kind of confident warmth that belongs to people who have never had to survive on their own. You'll love her, Amelia. Just give her a chance. She'll be good for us both. And then he had died of a fever 2 years later, leaving Amelia at 15 with a stepmother who had no legal obligation to keep her a modest house that was now Margaret's by inheritance, and a future that depended entirely on a woman who had never particularly liked her. Margaret had not been cruel in ways that were easy to name. She had never raised a hand to her, never starved her, never locked her in a room. She had simply been consistent and clear in 100 small ways that communicated, without ever stating it directly, that Amelia was a burden that had been accepted under duress and would be tolerated only as long as she made herself useful and did not require too much. She was the girl who ate last, the girl who slept in the smallest room, the girl whose opinions were not requested and whose presence was not celebrated, and whose small achievements, the way she had taught herself to make her father's favorite bread, the letters she wrote in a careful hand, the way she could add a column of numbers faster than anyone in her schoolhouse were acknowledged, with a silence that communicated that none of those things were particularly impressive or relevant. By the time she was 17, she had stopped expecting acknowledgement. By 18, she had stopped expecting much of anything. By 19, standing in the town square with a suitcase and the knowledge that she had been traded away for a sum of money, she had arrived at the particular kind of emptiness that comes not from dramatic suffering, but from years of quiet erasure. She did not feel angry. She was not sure she had the energy for anger. She felt more than anything like a very tired person who had finally been told to sit down. The ranch appeared through the trees in the late afternoon, and it was not what she had been bracing for. She had built a picture in her mind during the 4 hours of travel, something dark, something half-ruined, something that matched the stories. Broken fences and weathered boards, and the general atmosphere of a place that had given up on itself. What she saw instead was a house that was plain and solidly built with a long porch running along the front and a garden space alongside it that had gone to weeds but still showed evidence of having once been cared for. There was a barn sturdy and well-maintained, and beyond it a series of fenced fields that ran along the base of the mountain. Everything was clean. Nothing was broken. The whole property had the look of a place that was being kept up by someone who worked alone, and worked methodically, and did not ask for anyone's opinion about it. A man came out of the barn as they pulled in older lean with a white mustache and the kind of unhurried movement that belongs to people who have been working hard outdoors for so long that they no longer waste a single motion. "That's Holt," Elias said. "He manages the cattle and most of the outdoor work. He's been with me since the beginning. He doesn't talk much, but he's reliable." Holt approached the wagon and tipped his hat at Amelia with a formality that was so genuine it almost knocked her sideways. Nobody had tipped their hat at her since her father died. "Miss," he said. "Mr. Holt," she managed. "Just Holt." He looked at Elias. "Stove's going. I put the stew on this morning." "Thank you." Elias climbed down and held out a hand to help Amelia down from the wagon. She took it because refusing would have been more complicated than accepting, and she was too tired for complicated. His grip was firm, and he let go the moment her feet were on the ground. "I'll show you the house," he said. 10. Inside it was warm. That was the first thing. Warm and quiet, and smelling of wood smoke, and the stew Holt had put on, and there was a fire going in the main room's stone fireplace that made the whole space feel enclosed in a way that was not suffocating, but solid, like the walls were doing their job. Elias walked her through it in the same way he did most things briefly, without ceremony, pointing out what was where and what her access was. "This is your room," he said, opening a door off the main hallway. It was a small room, but it had a window that faced east, and a bed with a proper frame, and a washstand, and a chest of drawers. "I'll be in the barn until we've established what the arrangement looks like." I want you to have the house to yourself while you're settling in." Amelia stood in the doorway and looked at the room. "You're sleeping in the barn." "Yes." "Because of me." "Yes." She turned to look at him. "That isn't necessary." "I think it is," he said, not defensively, just matter-of-factly, the way he said most things. "You don't know me. You came here because your options were limited. The least I can do is make sure the space feels like yours until you decide whether you want to stay." He met her eyes. "Nothing that happens in this house happens without your agreement. That's not a rule I invented for your benefit, it's just how I run things." Amelia looked at him for a long moment. "I've never heard a man say that before," she said. Something moved briefly across his face, not quite a smile, but something adjacent to one. "I've known enough men who didn't, that I've had some time to think about what the alternative looks like." He left her to settle in. She stood in the middle of her new room, the first room that had been exclusively and unambiguously hers since she was 12 years old, and she did something she hadn't done in a very long time. She sat down on the edge of the bed and allowed herself very quietly to fall apart. Not dramatically, not in the way it happens in stories. She just sat there and pressed her hands together in her lap and let the shaking come through her, the long accumulated shaking of years of being careful and small and useful and grateful and never quite enough, and she breathed through it until it passed. Then she washed her face at the washstand, smoothed her hair back, and went to set the table for dinner. It was the only thing she knew how to offer. But it was something. And for now, something was going to have to do. Dinner was the three of them, Amelia, Elias, and Holt. And it was not as awkward as she had feared, mostly because Holt had a natural gift for the kind of steady, companionable silence that makes a table feel occupied without making it feel tense. Elias asked her over the stew what she was good at. "Cooking," she said. "Numbers. I was better at arithmetic than anyone in my class. Margaret used me to keep the household accounts because it was cheaper than paying someone." She said it without bitterness, because the bitterness had had years to cool into something more like simple fact. "I read well. I write well. I sew adequately. I learn fast." "Can you handle a firearm?" She blinked. "No." "Would you be willing to learn?" Is that something I'd need up here?" "Not daily," he said. "But we're 4 hours from town. If something happened and you were here alone, I'd want you to have options." He said this the way he said everything, as though it were simply practical, as though her safety were a logistical matter to be solved rather than an inconvenience or a weakness. "No pressure, just a question." "I'd be willing to learn?" she said. Holt made a small sound that might have been approval. After dinner, she washed the dishes without being asked, because it was the natural thing to do, and when Elias came to dry them beside her, she was briefly startled. In Margaret's house, no man had ever stood beside her at a washbowl, certainly not to help. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know," he said, and dried a bowl. The first week passed strangely. Strange because nothing bad happened. Strange because she kept waiting for the condition to appear. The unspoken expectation. The debt she would be asked to repay in some form she hadn't agreed to. The way the arrangement would reveal itself to be what she had always secretly known. Arrangements like this were. But nothing came. Elias was up before dawn every morning, working the property until midday, coming in for a meal that she had learned to time correctly, and then working again until the light went. He spoke to her when there was something to say, and was quiet when there wasn't, and both states were equally comfortable. He asked her opinion on small things, whether she wanted to adjust the kitchen arrangement, whether the schedule he'd outlined felt workable, whether the room was warm enough at night. He did not touch her. He did not look at her in ways that made her want to make herself smaller. He did not treat her like a possession, or a charity case, or a problem he had taken on out of some obscure sense of duty. He treated her like a person who was present and had preferences, and deserved to be consulted about matters that affected her. It was so disorienting that she spent the first 3 days convinced it was a performance. By the 4th day, she was beginning to suspect it wasn't. By the seventh day, she caught herself doing something she hadn't done in years. She caught herself looking forward to dinner. Not because of the food, because of the conversation. "Tell me about your father," Elias said one evening when the fire was going, and Holt had gone to bed, and the two of them were sitting with their coffee on opposite sides of the main room. She looked up from the mending she'd found in a basket near the chair. "Why?" "Because you've been here a week, and I've done most of the talking about practical matters, and I think there must be things you'd like to say that have nothing to do with scheduling, or cattle, or how the stove works." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He was kind. He thought kindness was enough, and I don't think he ever understood that it isn't if it isn't accompanied by attention." She paused. "He loved me. I know he did. He didn't look closely enough. He married Margaret because he couldn't see how she was looking at me when he wasn't watching." "What was she looking at you like?" Elias asked. "Like I was a problem she was agreeing to inherit." She said it simply. "Like I was the price of the thing she actually wanted." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Your father's estate. What happened to it?" "Margaret controls everything. There was nothing specifically designated for me. Father didn't think he'd need to do that, I expect. He trusted her. Or he trusted that things would work out." She looked at her mending. "Things often work out for people who are in a position to make them work out. They didn't especially work out for me." "You're aware," Elias said carefully, "that you may have legal standing to contest some of that." She looked up. "What do you mean?" "I mean that a man's estate when children are involved is not simply the property of a surviving spouse to do with as she pleases in every case. Depending on how things were arranged and what your father's will said, if there was one, and what the territorial laws say about the rights of natural children." He stopped. "I'm not a lawyer, but I know enough of the law to know it isn't as simple as your stepmother may have led you to believe." Amelia stared at him. "She told me there was nothing for me, that everything was in her name." "That may be true," he said. "Or it may not be. Do you know if your father left a will?" I never saw one." "That," said Elias, "is worth knowing more about." She sat with that for a moment. In 6 years, in all the quiet, grinding years of making herself useful and taking up as little space as possible, it had never occurred to her to question the version of reality Margaret had presented. Margaret had said there was nothing, and Amelia had believed her because Margaret was the adult and she was the child, and that was how those things worked. But she was not a child anymore. "How would I find out?" she asked. "I know a man in Raven Creek," Elias said. "Retired judge. He works out of his home now, but he has access to the county records and enough legal knowledge to tell you what your options are." He looked at her steadily. "If you want, I can arrange a meeting." "Why would you do that?" she asked. "That's not part of any arrangement we made." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." He picked up his coffee and looked into it. "I suppose I've had some experience watching people be told that the world is a certain way and then discovering later that the world wasn't that way at all. It was just that the people doing the telling had reasons to want it to look that way." She looked at him. "What happened to your wife?" she asked. She hadn't meant to. The question just came out. He was quiet for a long moment. "She was from one of the farming families in the valley," he said finally. "Her father's land was taken from him. Not legally, not fairly. There were men in this county who made a practice of it, finding struggling families manufacturing debt using the law as a weapon instead of a protection." His jaw tightened slightly. "She died of a fever, but I've always thought the grief had something to do with it. Watching her family lose everything. Watching the people who did it walk around Raven Creek like they'd done nothing wrong." "Is that what the scar is from?" Amelia asked quietly. "Fighting them." He touched it briefly, the way a person touches something they've stopped seeing. "Yes." "Did you win?" "I survived," he said. "That's a different thing." In the second week, she started working in the neglected garden. She hadn't been asked to, but she had found a set of tools in the shed beside the house, and the ground was still workable, and there was something about turning her hands into something active and productive that helped her think more clearly than sitting still did. Elias found her there on the third morning of it, on her hands and knees, pulling the weeds from between what had once been rows of kitchen herbs. "My wife planted those," he said. He stood a few feet back, and his voice had that careful quality it sometimes had, like he was holding something he wasn't sure he could put down again once he'd picked it up. "I know," Amelia said. She sat back on her heels and looked at him. "I should have asked before I started." "No," he said. "I'm glad you did." He was quiet for a moment. "I haven't been able to come near it since she died." He looked at the garden. "It seemed wrong to let it go, but I couldn't. I couldn't make myself come out here." "Do you want me to leave it?" "No." He said it more definitely. "No, don't leave it." She would have hated to see it go to weeds. He paused. She was a woman who liked things to grow. Amelia turned back to the weeding. After a moment, she heard him crouch down on the other side of the row and begin pulling weeds beside her. Neither of them spoke. But something happened in that silence. Something small and unremarkable and enormous, the way the most important things always are. 3 weeks and a rider came to the property. Amelia was in the kitchen when she heard the horse, and she heard Elias come out of the barn, and the brief exchange of words outside, and then the sound of the rider leaving. And then Elias came into the house with a particular look on his face, not angry, but alert, in the way that made her understand that the mountain's peace was not as complete as it had seemed. "That was a message from Charles Whitaker," he said. She knew the name. Everyone in Raven Creek knew the name. Whitaker owned the bank and a significant portion of everything else in the valley, and his name appeared on half the town's transactions in one form or another. "What did he want?" she asked. Elias set the letter on the table. "To buy my land." He said it flatly. "He's made the offer before. This is the 4th time in 2 years. And you've always refused. I've always refused. Why does he want it so specifically?" He looked at her. "That," he said, "is a very good question. And I don't think I have the full answer yet. But I think I'm starting to understand that the answer matters considerably more than I'd realized." He folded the letter and put it in his coat pocket. "I think," he said slowly, "that we may have more in common than I initially supposed, Miss Whitmore. Both of us are in possession of something someone else wants, and the person who wants it is not accustomed to being told no." Outside, the wind moved through the pines, and somewhere at the base of the mountain, the town of Raven Creek went about its ordinary business, unaware that on a scarred man's mountain ranch, a girl who had spent 6 years being treated as nothing was beginning very slowly to understand that she might be worth considerably more than she'd been told. The letter from Charles Whitaker sat in Elias's coat pocket for 3 days before either of them mentioned it again. Amelia noticed the weight of it on him, not because he spoke about it, but because of the way he didn't. Elias Vance was not a man who fidgeted or paced or showed his thinking on his face the way most people did. But she had been watching him long enough now to recognize the difference between his ordinary quiet and the quiet that meant something was working through him that he hadn't yet decided how to handle. At dinner, he would pause mid-sentence. Out in the yard, she would catch him standing still for a moment too long, looking at nothing in particular, with the focused attention of a man doing arithmetic in his head. On the 4th morning, she put 2 cups of coffee on the table and sat down across from him and said, "Tell me what's actually in the letter." He looked at her. "I told you what was in it." "You told me it was a land offer. You didn't tell me why it's been bothering you for 4 days." A pause. He wrapped both hands around his cup. "He mentioned you," he said. The word landed in the room like something dropped from a height. "Me," she said. Not by name specifically, he was more careful than that. But the phrasing was deliberate. He reached into his coat and set the letter on the table between them. He expressed his hope that my new domestic arrangement was proving comfortable, and mentioned that certain members of the community had concerns about the welfare of a young woman living alone in a remote property with a man of, he paused slightly, questionable reputation. Amelia looked at the letter. She did not pick it up. "He's using me," she said, not a question. "He's establishing a lever," Elias said. "Whether he intends to pull it or just let it sit there and make me nervous is the question I haven't answered yet." What does he actually want? The land. But more than the land specifically, he wants the valley. My property is the last significant holdout between his existing holdings and the northern pass. He turned the cup in his hands. The pass controls the cattle route to the northern markets. Whoever holds the land near it controls the tolls, controls what gets through and what doesn't. He looked at her. It's worth considerably more than he's offering. Then why would you ever sell? I wouldn't. He said it simply. This land was my wife's family's land before it was mine. Her father lost the original claim to manufactured debt, which is a thing Whitaker's people have done to a number of families in this valley, I've come to understand. I bought it at a fair price from the man Whitaker sold it to after he'd stripped it from the family. Bringing it back was... He stopped. It mattered to her, and it matters to me. Amelia looked at him across the table. So he can't make you sell? He can make it difficult for me to keep it, Elias said. That's the thing about men like Whitaker. They understand that there are more ways to take something from a person than simply buying it. She thought about that. She thought about her father's estate, about the way a woman could spend 6 years inside a situation without ever understanding that the situation had been engineered. She thought about all the small levers Margaret had pulled without Amelia ever recognizing them as levers. What are you going to do? She asked. I'm going to find out exactly what he knows, he said. And then I'm going to make sure he understands that whatever he thinks he knows, it doesn't change anything. He picked up his coffee. The conversation was done in the way Elias's conversations were sometimes done, not rudely, but completely, as though the matter had been said to its conclusion, and there was no use adding more words to it. But Amelia sat with what he'd told her long after he'd gone back outside, and something that had been coiled quietly in her chest for days began very carefully to tighten. She went to see Judge Harlan Price the following week. Elias had arranged it without making a production of it. He mentioned one evening that he had business in town on Thursday, and that if she wanted to come along and speak with the judge, it could be done in the same trip. She said yes. She thought about it for 3 days, and then stopped thinking about it, because thinking about it made her feel a particular kind of hope that was very close to the kind that had gotten her hurt before, and she had learned to be careful with hope. The drive to Raven Creek took the full 4 hours, and for most of it, Elias talked to her about the valley, its history, the families that had worked it, the way things had changed since the railroad came through and brought Whitaker and men like him along with it. He spoke about it without bitterness, but with the specific knowledge of a person who had paid close attention for a long time. Whitaker's been here 12 years, he said. When he arrived, there were 14 independent farming operations in the lower valley. There are now 4. The rest have been absorbed into his holdings one way or another. How? Amelia asked. If it's illegal, it isn't always illegal. That's the elegant part of it. He kept his eyes on the road. A man falls behind on a bank payment, Whitaker's bank. The bank applies pressure within its legal rights to do so. The man can't make up the shortfall fast enough. The bank forecloses, also legal. Whitaker then purchases the foreclosed property at below market value through a third party, so his name isn't directly attached. He paused. Legal at every individual step. Monstrous in the aggregate. Amelia thought about that. But if you could prove the pattern, you'd need documents, he said. Internal bank documents. Records of the individual transactions linked in a way that demonstrates intent rather than coincidence. And those documents are not in a place where anyone has been able to get to them. She was quiet for a moment. I kept Margaret's household accounts for 4 years, she said. He glanced at her. I know what financial records look like, she said. I know how a person hides things in numbers. Margaret used to pay certain bills twice through different accounts, so the money would look like it went somewhere it didn't actually go. She looked at the road ahead of them. I'm not saying I could get to Whitaker's records. I'm saying that if someone could, I'd know what I was looking at. He was quiet for a beat. That is, he said carefully, a very specific and useful skill. I'm aware. I'm not going to ask you to do anything that puts you in a position of danger, he said immediately. I know you're not. She looked at him. I'm saying it's a thing I could do. Not now. Not without a plan. But it's a thing I could do if we ever had access. He didn't say anything for a while. Then, you're not what I expected. What did you expect? Someone more frightened, he said, not unkindly. You seemed frightened in the square. I was frightened, she said. I'm not frightened the same way anymore. She looked out at the road. Being frightened and being capable are not the same thing. I was both then. I think I might just be the second thing now. Judge Price was 72 years old and lived in a house so full of stacked paper and leather-bound volumes that there appeared to be no flat surface in the entirety of it that was not serving as a shelf. He had a white beard and sharp brown eyes, and the manner of a man who had spent 50 years listening to people tell him partial truths and had gotten very good at identifying the parts that were missing. He shook Amelia's hand and showed her to a chair that had been cleared for the purpose, and then he listened to her for 20 minutes without interrupting once. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Your father, he said. Thomas Whitmore. He passed in 1875. Yes, sir. And you've been told there was no will? Yes, sir, by my stepmother. She never showed me a document. He rose from his chair with the deliberateness of a man whose joints required notice before being asked to cooperate, and moved to one of the paper-stacked shelves along the far wall. He pulled a ledger from between two volumes and opened it on the standing surface of the shelf, running a finger down a column. Whitmore. Thomas A. Whitmore. He tapped the page. Registered a will with this office in 1873, 2 years before he died. The room was very still. There's a will, Amelia said. There was a filing, Price said carefully. Whether the document itself is still where it should be is a different matter. The original would have been deposited with a separate record. The county changed its record-keeping system in 1878, and there was a great deal of reorganization. Some things were not as carefully preserved as they should have been. He looked at her over his glasses. However, she repeated, a will that was registered does not simply cease to exist because its physical copy is inconvenient. It can be located, reconstructed, if necessary, through witness testimony, contested, and in many cases enforced regardless of what a surviving spouse may have claimed about its non-existence. He closed the ledger. What I am telling you, Miss Whitmore, is that you have standing. Whether you have a case depends on what that will says and whether it can be found. But you have standing. That is not nothing. Amelia sat very still in the cleared chair. For 6 years, she had believed herself to have nothing. No claim, no right, no ground to stand on. Margaret had said so. The absence of anyone telling her differently had confirmed it. She had accepted the emptiness the way you accept weather as a condition of existence, rather than a choice that someone had made on her behalf. But standing was not nothing. Standing was the first thing. Standing was where you started. How do I find out what the will says? She asked. You come back, he said, and you give me some time to make inquiries. Carefully. He paused. And you don't mention to anyone in Raven Creek that you've spoken to me, particularly not anyone connected to the bank. She looked at him sharply. He met her eyes steadily. The Whitmore property sits on ground that certain parties have shown interest in for some years, he said. I have no evidence of anything improper, but I am 72 years old, and I have watched this valley for a long time, and I have learned to be careful about what I say and to whom. She did not speak about it to Elias on the drive home. She was not sure why not, because she didn't trust him, but because the information felt very new and very fragile, like something she needed to hold close for a while before she handed it to another person. She had spent her whole life handing her fragile things to people who set them down carelessly. She was learning to wait. He didn't push her. He talked about other things or was quiet, and by the time they came back up through the pines in the late afternoon, she felt steadier. That night after dinner, she helped Holt mend a section of fence rail that had splintered, holding the boards in place while he hammered, and she thought about what the judge had said. She thought about her father, who had been kind but careless, who had registered a will 2 years before his death and apparently said nothing to his daughter about what was in it. She thought about Margaret's smooth voice saying, "There's nothing for you, there's nothing to contest. It's all been settled," and how a lie only works if the person hearing it has no reason to ask further questions. She had never had a reason. Until now. "You all right?" Holt asked, pausing his hammer. "Yes," she said. Then, "Do you know much about the history of this land, Holt, about what happened to the families in the valley?" He looked at her sideways. "Some. Did you know the family that owned this land before Elias?" He was quiet for a moment. "Caldwell family," he said. "Good people, 3 daughters and a boy. The boy died young. The father was a hard worker, fair man, kept good cattle." He drove another nail. "Lost the property in '76. Said he fell behind on the bank payments. Couldn't make the arithmetic work no matter how hard he tried." He paused. "Some arithmetic don't work because the numbers are wrong, and some don't work because somebody else is moving the figures around when you're not watching. That's what I think happened to the Caldwells. What Elias thinks too." "Whitaker," Amelia said. Holt nodded once. "Elias married the youngest Caldwell daughter, Catherine." He set down his hammer and looked at the rail. "She was a good woman. This land being back in family hands mattered to her more than most things. And Whitaker wants it." "Whitaker wants everything," Holt said. "That's not a figure of speech. He wants the whole valley. He's been working on it for 12 years, and he's close." He looked at her. "This land is the piece he can't get. Not because Elias is wealthy or powerful, but because Elias is the kind of man who cannot be made afraid and cannot be made to feel ashamed, and those are the 2 main tools Whitaker uses." He picked up the hammer again. "What Whitaker's going to figure out, if he hasn't already, is that now Elias has got something else to consider. Something that can be threatened." It took her a moment to understand what he meant. When she did, she went very still. "Me," she said. "Not saying it to worry you," Holt said. "Saying it because you seem like a woman who'd rather know a thing than not know it." "I'd rather know it," she said. "Thought so." He hammered the last nail. "You're not the first person Whitaker's tried to use as leverage against somebody. And the people he's used that way, most of them didn't know they were being used until it was too late to do anything about it." She helped him carry the tools back to the shed in silence. But her mind was working, moving through things the way she used to move through household accounts, looking for the place where the numbers didn't add up, looking for the figure that had been moved when nobody was watching. She started paying attention to the mail. It was a small thing, and she was careful not to make it obvious. But she noticed over the following 2 weeks that Elias received a particular category of envelope-thick paper official-looking seals, sent from the county offices in Helena, with a regularity that suggested something procedural was in motion. He never discussed them at dinner. He filed them in a wooden box on the shelf in the main room without expression. She did not ask. But she listened when he and Holt talked in the early mornings, before she was expected to be present, and she began to assemble a picture from the pieces she collected. Whitaker had filed a motion with the county challenging the original deed to the mountain property. The basis of the challenge was a technical question about the chain of title, the series of ownership transfers that had to be documented and unbroken for a deed to be legally solid. If any link in that chain could be shown to be defective, the deed could be challenged. And if the deed was challenged successfully, the property could be declared contested and tied up in legal proceedings long enough for a man of limited means to be financially destroyed by the cost of defending it. Elias was not a man of limited means exactly, but he was not wealthy. And legal proceedings in territorial Montana in 1882 were slow, expensive, and subject to the influence of men who had relationships with the right people. Amelia understood this dynamic intimately. She had watched Margaret navigate it on a smaller scale for years. She also understood something that Elias might not have considered. She had been inside Margaret Whitmore's life for 6 years. Margaret, who was a woman of deliberate and careful financial management, had had dealings with the Raven Creek Bank over that same period. And Amelia, who had kept the household accounts, had seen some of those dealings pass through the numbers she managed. She had not understood their significance at the time. She was beginning to understand it now. The confrontation she had not been expecting happened on a Thursday afternoon when a wagon she didn't recognize came up the road to the property. Elias was out on the far field with Holt. Amelia was in the kitchen working through the last of the afternoon bread. When she heard the wagon, and she went to the window and looked out and saw 2 men she didn't know climb down from it and stand in the yard looking at the house with the kind of deliberate patience that suggested they had been sent, and that they were comfortable waiting for whoever they'd been sent to deal with. She went outside. "Help you," she said. The taller of the 2 men looked her over in a way that she had experienced before, not quite threatening, but constructed specifically to communicate that she was being assessed and found to be of uncertain consequence. "We're here to see Vance," he said. "He's occupied," she said. "You can wait, or you can leave a message." "We'll wait." "Then you'll wait here," she said. "Not in the house." The second man smiled, which was not a friendly smile. "Miss, we just need to speak with your employer about the property matter. Nothing to concern yourself about." "I find most things concerning myself about," she said. "It's a habit I've developed." The tall man's eyes narrowed. "You're the Whitmore girl." She did not change her expression. "I'm Amelia Whitmore." "Yes." "Mrs. Whitmore the elder. Mrs. Whitmore sends her regards." He reached into his coat and removed an envelope. "And this." He held it out. "It's a legal notice. Technically it's meant for Vance, but given that it concerns you directly, I imagine he'll want to share it with you." She took the envelope without reaching for it eagerly. "Is there anything else?" "Mr. Whitaker would like to impress on Mr. Vance that the offer on the table is a fair one," he said, "and that the current situation on this property is the sort of thing that draws attention, the sort of attention that tends to complicate things for everyone involved." "I'll pass that along," Amelia said. She stood and watched them get back in the wagon and drive away. Then she went inside, sat down at the kitchen table, and opened the envelope. It was a legal notice, as the man had said. A motion filed in the county court challenging the deed to the property and requesting a hearing. Attached to it was a secondary document she had to read twice before she understood what she was looking at. It was a sworn affidavit from Margaret Whitmore, stating that Amelia Whitmore had left the family home under irregular circumstances, that her mental state at the time of departure had been a matter of concern, and that her current residence on a remote property with an unmarried man of questionable character raised serious questions about her welfare and judgment. Questions that the county, in the interest of the protection of young women, ought to consider when evaluating any legal matters in which she might be involved as a witness or party. Amelia set the document down on the table. She sat with it for a long moment. In the past, a month ago certainly, or a week into her time on this mountain, it would have cracked something in her. The specific quality of its cruelty would have found the familiar hollow place in her chest where Margaret's assessments had always landed, and it would have echoed there, and she would have sat with the old question, what if she's right? What if I am what they say I am? What if there is something wrong with me that makes me untrustworthy, unworthy, impossible to defend? She sat with it. And then she picked it up again and read it more carefully. Because there was something wrong with the affidavit. Something in the structure of it that she couldn't immediately place, but that produced in her the same sensation she got when Margaret's accounts didn't balance a low, persistent signal that something had been moved. She was still reading it when Elias came in. He saw her face before he saw the document. What happened? 2 men came, she said. Whitaker's, I think. She held out the envelope. This is a court filing, and an affidavit from Margaret. He took it, read it. His expression changed in ways she was learning to read: the slight tightening around his eyes, the particular stillness that meant he was controlling something. "She's calling your judgment into question," he said, as a preemptive move. "If you're ever in a position to testify or act as a witness in any proceeding, this puts your credibility on trial first." "I know," Amelia said. "But that's not what I want you to look at." She reached over and pointed to the bottom section of the affidavit. "Look at the notarization." He looked. "Hika. The notary seal is from the Raven Creek Bank," she said, "Whitaker's bank, and the date on it is 2 weeks ago. Which means Margaret signed this in coordination with Whitaker's office more than a week before the court motion was even filed." He looked at her. "They're working together," she said. "Not just Whitaker pursuing you and Margaret trying to protect herself. They're actively coordinating." She held his gaze. "Which means whatever Whitaker wants from your land, Margaret has a stake in it too. Which means something happened between them, some transaction, some agreement that I didn't know about when I was keeping her accounts. Or that you saw and didn't know the significance of," he said slowly. "Yes." The word hung there between them. She watched him think. She watched the pieces move behind his eyes, not quickly, but thoroughly, the way Elias worked through most things. "Do you remember anything specific?" he asked. "Any transaction, any name, anything unusual in the accounts?" "I remember a series of payments in '79, she said. "I thought they were household expenses going to a supplier. But the name on the recipient account was a company I didn't recognize, and when I asked Margaret about it, she told me it was a new dry goods arrangement, and I was not to worry about it." She paused. "I wrote it down in the ledger as she told me to, but I remember the company name." "What was it?" "Harwick and Associates," she said. Something moved across his face. "What?" she asked. "Harwick and Associates is a land acquisition firm," he said. "They operate out of Helena. They're one of the entities Whitaker uses to purchase properties after foreclosure, so his name isn't directly on the transaction." He looked at her. "If Margaret Whitmore was making payments to Harwick and Associates in '79, then she wasn't buying dry goods," Amelia said. "No," he said. "She was not." The fire in the main room cracked and settled. Outside, the wind moved through the pine trees at the edge of the property. "What did she get in return?" Amelia asked. Not the question she wanted to ask, but the one that mattered. "I don't know yet," Elias said. "But I think I know who might." He moved toward the door, then stopped and turned back. "You did well," he said. "With the men, standing out there and holding the line." She hadn't thought about it as holding a line. She'd just done the thing that needed doing. "It didn't feel like anything special," she said. "It never does," he said, "when you do it right." Tieg. He rode to town the following morning before she was fully awake, and she spent the day doing the ordinary work of the ranch and not allowing herself to pace, because pacing was what she used to do in Margaret's house when she was frightened and had nowhere to put it, and she was not going to do that anymore. She cleaned the kitchen. She worked in the garden. She taught herself with Holt's patient instruction how to mend a bridle. "You're not scared?" Holt observed, watching her work the leather. "I didn't say that." "You're not acting scared." "Acting scared doesn't accomplish much." She pulled the stitching tight. "I was scared for 6 years in Margaret's house, and it didn't change a single thing. So I'm trying something different." "What are you trying?" "Being useful," she said, "and paying attention." Holt was quiet for a moment. Then, "Elias hasn't had anyone paying attention in a long time," he said. "It's good for him." She looked at the stitching. "I'm not here to be good for him," she said. "I'm here because he offered me a place when I needed one." "Those two things aren't exclusive," Holt said mildly. She did not answer that, but she thought about it for a long time after, while the afternoon moved into evening, and the fire was laid and the stew went on, and the mountain held its particular kind of silence around the house, deep and clean, and full of pine and cold air, and the distant sound of wind. She thought about what it meant to pay attention to someone. She thought about how little she had been attended to in 6 years, and how extraordinary it was that a month's worth of consistent, quiet consideration from a man who asked nothing of her in return had begun to undo something she had spent years constructing around herself as protection. She did not call it anything. She was too careful for that. She had learned from her father that naming something before you understood it fully was the surest way to lose it. She simply noted it the way she noted figures in a ledger. And she waited for Elias to come home. Yeah, he returned at dusk with mud on his boots and a look on his face that she had not seen before. Something that was not exactly worry and not exactly anger, but existed in the space between them where things that cannot be addressed directly tend to live. She had dinner ready. She set it in front of him and waited. "The judge found something, Pat," he said. "What?" "Your father's will." He looked at her. "Or rather, he found the record of your father's will and the discrepancy between what the will said and what Mrs. Whitmore claimed it said." Amelia's hands went still on the table. "What did the will say?" she asked. "Half," Elias said. "Your father left half the property and accounts to you in trust until your 18th birthday to be administered by an attorney of record." He held her gaze. "That attorney died in 1877, at which point, per the terms of the will, responsibility for the trust was supposed to transfer to the county probate court." "It never did," she said. She could hear her own voice from a very great distance. "It never did," he agreed, "which means the money that was supposed to be held in trust for you, the money that was supposed to come to you on your 18th birthday, was either never properly transferred or was transferred somewhere else. And who had access to it in the meantime?" He looked at her, and she already knew the answer, but she needed to hear it said. "Margaret," he said. The fire crackled. Amelia sat with the shape of it, the exact shape of 6 years of being made to feel worthless, the precise architecture of a woman who had taken everything and then smiled and said, "There's nothing for you." And she breathed through it carefully, the way she had breathed through things before. Then she looked at Elias. "I want my money back," she said. It was the simplest thing she had ever said and the most certain. He looked at her for a long moment. "Then we're going to need those Harwick and Associates records," he said. "I know. It won't be simple." "I know that too." She picked up her fork. Simple would have been Margaret telling the truth in 1875. We're well past simple. Outside, the last of the daylight left the mountain. Somewhere in Raven Creek, Charles Whitaker sat in his bank with his plans and his leverage and his 12 years of patient accumulation, unaware that a girl he had dismissed as someone else's inconvenience was sitting at a kitchen table on a mountain, and had just decided quietly and completely that she was done being moved around like a figure in someone else's accounting. She had always been good with numbers, and she was beginning to understand that someone had been cooking the books on her entire life. The plan came together the way most necessary things do, not all at once, but in pieces, each one falling into place, because the one before it had been set down right. Elias knew a man in Helena named Croft. Not a friend exactly, but the kind of man whose usefulness and trustworthiness occupied the same space, a former territorial marshal who had retired into private legal work and who had, over the course of a long career, accumulated a precise and detailed knowledge of the ways in which powerful men in Montana arranged for the law to serve their interests rather than anyone else's. Elias had helped him once years ago in a matter that Croft had never forgotten and never mentioned, which was exactly the kind of debt that mattered. He sent a letter on a Friday. By Tuesday, a reply had come back, and Elias read it at the kitchen table while Amelia poured the morning coffee and did not ask, and then he set it down and looked at her. "Croft knows Harwick and Associates," he said. "He's been watching them for 2 years. He has documentation of 4 separate transactions that link them to Whitaker's bank as the originating source of funds. What he doesn't have is the piece that connects those transactions to specific properties, specific families, in a way that demonstrates a pattern rather than coincidence." Amelia sat down. "And the Whitmore account records would provide that. If what you saw in 79 is what I think it is, yes." He turned the letter over on the table. "Croft thinks there may be additional documentation inside the bank itself. Internal ledgers." Correspondence between Whitaker and the Harwick principals. If it exists, it would be in the bank's private record room. She looked at him steadily. And how does a person get into a bank's private record room? They don't, he said. Not without a legal order compelling disclosure. And a legal order requires a judge and sufficient preliminary evidence to justify it. He paused. What Croft is saying is that the Whitmore account records, the ones Margaret kept, the ones you worked on, are potentially the preliminary evidence. If we can demonstrate a financial connection between Margaret and Whitaker that predates the land challenge, it establishes that Whitaker had a motive for manipulating your father's estate, which gives a judge reason to look further. But we don't have the records, Amelia said. They're in Margaret's house. Yes, he said. The word sat between them. I could go, she said. No. He said it immediately and without qualification. Elias. No. He looked at her, and there was something in his face that was not negotiable in the way most things with him were. I am not sending you into that house. Not to retrieve evidence against a woman who has already filed a legal affidavit against you, and who is in coordination with a man who has the resources to make your life considerably worse than it has already been. I'm not asking you to send me, she said. I'm saying I could go. And I'm saying you won't. She looked at him for a long moment. You don't get to decide that. You're right, he said. I don't. He held her gaze. I'm asking you not to. There's a difference, and I know you know it. She did know it. That was the thing, she knew it because he had been careful from the first day to make the difference between a request and a command felt. And the fact that he was making the distinction now, when he clearly wanted badly for her to agree, was not nothing. She sat back. Then what? I go, he said. Not to the house. I wouldn't get within 50 yards of Margaret Whitmore's property without someone running to tell Whitaker. He thought for a moment. But the household accounts weren't kept in the house. You told me yourself you worked on them at the merchant's office sometimes, when the figures needed to be reconciled against the store's outgoing records. She went still. Amos Fincher, she said. He let me use the back room at the dry goods store. Would Fincher still have copies of those reconciled records? She thought about it. Merchants keep their records. They're required to for tax purposes. If what I worked on was reconciled against his store ledgers, there would be a copy in his files. She frowned. But Amos Fincher is not going to hand over his private business records to a man he's been told is dangerous. No, Elias agreed. But he might hand them to you. She went to Raven Creek alone. That had not been the original plan, and Elias had not loved the adjustment. But she had made the argument plainly. A woman walking into Amos Fincher's dry goods store was unremarkable. A woman walking in with Elias Vance was a story that would be in every household in town before the day was out. And they could not afford to be a story right now. He had stood in the yard with his hands in his coat pockets and his jaw set, and watched her drive the wagon out, and she had not looked back, because if she'd looked back, she might have found the expression on his face too much to leave behind. Raven Creek felt different to her now. That surprised her. She had lived in this town for 6 years and known its rhythms and its particular social geography as well as she knew her own hands. But something had shifted in the 5 weeks since she'd left. She saw it now from the outside, the way you see a painting differently when you step back from it. The way the town's smallness was not cozy, but confining. The way its familiarity was not warmth, but habit. The way the people on the main street who glanced at her and looked away again were not avoiding her out of indifference, but out of the specific discomfort of people who had made a judgment and did not want to be asked to revisit it. She tied the wagon at the post and went into Fincher's. Amos Fincher was a round, careful man in his late 50s who had run the dry goods store for 30 years and knew everyone in the valley's business without ever appearing to collect it deliberately. He looked up when she came in, and something moved across his face. Not quite guilt, but the expression of a man who had thought about a person and had not been comfortable with his own conclusions. "Amelia," he said. He stopped. "You look well." "Mr. Fincher," she said. "I need to speak with you about something." Privately, if you don't mind." He looked at the two other customers in the store, made a small gesture to his assistant, and led her into the back room. It was cluttered and smelled of paper and old wood, and the particular dusty warmth of a room that is heavily used but never quite cleaned. She knew it well. She had spent hours in this room working through columns of figures at the small table in the corner. "I need to look at the household reconciliation records from 77 through 80, she said. "The accounts I worked on for Margaret." He looked at her. "Those are private records, Amelia. I know, but I worked on them. My handwriting is in those ledgers, Mr. Fincher. My name is attached to that work." She held his gaze. "I have reason to believe that what I recorded in those books was not what I was told it was, and the difference between what I recorded and what it actually represents may be evidence of something that affected me directly, something that affected my father's estate." He was quiet for a long moment. Something worked through his face, the particular conflict of a man who knows more than he has said, and has been waiting without quite admitting it to himself, for the moment when saying it becomes unavoidable. "Your father's estate," he said carefully. "His will," she said. "Were you aware there was one?" Amos Fincher looked at the shelf of ledgers to his left for a long moment. Then he pulled out a chair and sat down heavily, which was not the response she had been expecting. "Sit down," he said. She sat. "I knew Thomas," he said. "We were not close friends, but I knew him well enough. When he died, I was present at the reading of his will. Margaret arranged it very quickly within the week, which I thought was fast, but I didn't say anything because grief makes people move at strange speeds, and it wasn't my place." He paused. "The will was read. There was a portion designated for you. Margaret acknowledged it. And then 3 days later she came to me and told me that the trust arrangement had been complicated by the attorney's handling, and that the probate court had suggested it was simpler to consolidate everything under her management until the legal questions were resolved." Amelia sat very still. "And you believed her?" "I had no reason not to." He looked at his hands. "I should have. Looking back, I should have. But she was very composed and very certain, and the way she explained it made sense if you didn't push on it, and I—" He stopped. "I didn't push on it." "Who else was at the reading?" Amelia asked. "Doc Hayward, Reverend Mills, Margaret's cousin from Billings." He paused. "And Charles Whitaker." The name landed in the room like a stone in still water. "Whitaker was at my father's will reading," Amelia said. "He was a business associate of your father's, or he presented himself that way. He had made a loan to Thomas the year before the fever, said it was a friendly arrangement, no formal documentation, just between men who trusted each other." He looked at her. "After Thomas died, Whitaker came to Margaret with the claim that the loan was outstanding, and legally the estate owed him. Was it legitimate? I don't know. There was no written record of it that anyone produced, but Margaret paid it, out of the estate, within the month." He met her eyes. "I've thought about it many times since. A payment out of the estate to Whitaker within a month of your father's death, with no documentation of the original loan. And then a will that somehow never resulted in your inheritance reaching you." Amelia's hands were very steady in her lap. She made them stay that way. "I need to see those records, Mr. Fincher," she said. "The Whitmore reconciliation ledgers, all of them." He stood up without another word and went to the far shelf. She was back on the mountain before dark, with 3 ledgers wrapped in cloth in the bag beside her on the wagon seat. Elias was in the yard when she pulled in, and he moved toward the wagon before it had fully stopped, which was not something he did with his damaged leg, unless he had been standing still for a long time, waiting, and couldn't wait anymore. "You're all right," he said. "I'm all right." She handed him the bag. "I have the ledgers, and I have something else." She climbed down. "Whitaker was at my father's will reading. He made a claim against the estate, an undocumented loan, and Margaret paid it within a month of father's death." He was very still. "An undocumented loan," he said. "Paid to Whitaker directly, from the estate that was supposed to be partially held in trust for me." She looked at him. "It's not just that they're working together now. It started before. It started at the beginning. The minute my father died, Whitaker was there. Something crossed Elias's face that she had not seen before. A cold, focused anger, the kind that does not flare up and burn out, but settles in and stays. He does this, Elias said quietly. He finds the moment of vulnerability. A man dies, a family is in grief, the paperwork isn't in order yet. That's when he moves. That's always when he moves. He did it to the Caldwell family, Amelia said. Your wife's family. Yes. And he's been doing it for 12 years. To how many families? I don't know the full number, Elias said. But I intend to find out. Dink! They worked through the ledgers that night, all three of them at the kitchen table. Elias, Amelia, and Holt, who turned out to have a sharp eye for figures and a long memory for names that proved more useful than he'd let on. Amelia went through the numbers, the way she had always gone through numbers, systematically, column by column, building the picture from the bottom up, rather than trying to see it all at once. She explained as she went, pointing to entries, translating the dry arithmetic into narrative. Here, she said, pointing to a column in the second ledger, this is the Harwick payment I remembered. I recorded it as a dry goods supplier. But look at the amount, $47 in a single month. That's not dry goods. That's not even close. What would $47 represent? Elias asked. A fee, she said. A finder's fee maybe, or a referral arrangement. Something that doesn't have a physical product attached to it. She moved her finger down the column. And look, it recurs, monthly with variations, sometimes 30, sometimes 60. The amounts fluctuate the way a commission would fluctuate, based on something. Based on what was brought in that month, Holt said slowly. They both looked at him. If she was sending people to Whitaker, Holt said, families who were in debt or struggling. If she was identifying them and pointing them in the direction of his bank and getting a cut of whatever he took from them. The room went very quiet. Amelia looked at the ledger, at the numbers she had written in her own careful hand 6 years ago, not knowing what she was recording. She was a recruiter, Amelia said. The word felt horrible in her mouth. She was identifying vulnerable families and funneling them to Whitaker's operation. And getting paid for it, Elias said. And getting paid for it. She closed the ledger, while living on money that was supposed to be mine. The fire in the main room was burning low. Nobody moved to add wood. This is enough for Croft, Elias said finally. The pattern is here, the recurring payments, the Harwick connection, the timing relative to the estate. If we get this to him, and he can match the families against the foreclosure records, it's still circumstantial without the bank records, Amelia said. We can show that Margaret was receiving payments from a Harwick-linked account. We can show the timing. But to connect it conclusively to Whitaker's operation, we need something from inside the bank. I know. He was quiet for a moment. Croft has been trying to build a relationship with one of Whitaker's clerks, a young man named Denny Marsh. Marsh has been with the bank 3 years, and Croft thinks he's uncomfortable with what he's seen, not uncomfortable enough to act on his own, but possibly uncomfortable enough to act if he understood that there were people willing to protect him. Has Croft approached him? Amelia asked. Not yet. He's been waiting until he had enough preliminary evidence to make the risk feel worth it to Marsh. He looked at the ledger. I think we might have it now. The letter to Croft went out the next morning. What came back 4 days later was not a letter. It was Croft himself riding up the mountain road on a gray horse on a Wednesday afternoon, with a leather bag across his saddle and the look of a man who had decided that some things needed to be done in person. He was in his early 60s, compact and deliberate, with the watchful stillness of a man who had spent years in circumstances where reading a room fast was the difference between going home and not going home. He shook Amelia's hand when Elias introduced them, and his grip was brief and genuine. And he looked at her in the way that certain experienced men look at people who have accomplished something they didn't expect, with a recalibration that was respectful rather than surprised. The ledgers, he said when they were seated at the kitchen table with the books open between them. This is better than I'd hoped. Can you use them? Elias asked. I can use them to approach Marsh, Croft said. "Which is what needs to happen. I've been watching that boy for 8 months, and my read on him is that he's a decent man who made a decision he can't unmake. He went to work at that bank before he understood what it was, and now he's in deep enough that getting out feels impossible." He looked at the ledgers. But what's in here changes his calculation. If he understands that there are other parties already building a case that his cooperation isn't the whole thing, but the piece that completes it, he may be willing to move. What does he risk? Amelia asked. Croft looked at her. His position. Possibly worse if Whitaker finds out before any formal action is taken. He paused. Which is why the timing matters enormously. If Marsh agrees to provide access to the bank records, we have to be ready to move the same day. We can't give Whitaker any window to react. How long? Elias asked. A week to approach Marsh. Another week to prepare if he agrees. Croft looked at both of them. Can you hold your position for 2 weeks? We've been holding it for years, Elias said. They held it for 9 days before Whitaker forced the timeline. Amelia was in the garden on a Thursday morning when she heard horses, not one, not two, but several, the sound of a group moving up the mountain road with the particular purposefulness that groups with authority tend to have. She stood up and saw them come through the trees, 4 men on horseback, and behind them a wagon, and behind the wagon a 5th rider she recognized. Sheriff Dale Purcell. He was a man she had always known by reputation more than interaction. A thick, gray-mustached figure who projected authority through sheer physical presence and who had been sheriff of the county for 11 years, long enough that the boundaries between his judgment and Whitaker's had blurred in ways that perhaps even he no longer noticed. Elias came out of the barn. Purcell pulled his horse up in the yard. "Vance," he said. "Dale," Elias said. "I've got a court order here." Purcell held up a folded paper. Property preservation order pending the outcome of the deed challenge. Requires an inventory of the property and a restriction on the removal of any assets until the court matter is resolved. Amelia walked forward from the garden without making a decision to do it. She was standing beside Elias before she was fully aware that she had moved. "What does a property preservation order mean in practice?" she asked. Purcell looked at her with the flat attention of a man who had not expected to be addressed. "It means nothing on this property moves, sells, or transfers until the deed challenge is settled, miss." "And how long does a deed challenge typically take to settle?" she asked. "That depends on the court's schedule, which in this county," she said, "is managed by judges who are appointed through a process in which the county's largest financial institution has historically had significant influence." She held his gaze. "Is that an accurate characterization, Sheriff?" A silence. "I'm just serving the order," Purcell said. His voice had flattened. "I understand," Amelia said. "I'm just trying to understand the context." She turned to Elias. "We should send word to Croft today." Elias looked at her for one steady moment. "Yes," he said. "We should." He looked at Purcell. "The order will be complied with. Tell Whitaker he's welcome to his inventory." His voice was very quiet. "Tell him to be thorough. I want him to understand exactly what's here." Purcell did not answer that. He dismounted, gave his horse to one of his men, and began the inventory process with the methodical discomfort of a man who knows he is doing someone else's work and has stopped examining the question of why. Amelia went inside and wrote the letter to Croft herself, because her handwriting was faster than Elias's and her hands were not shaking. She sealed it and handed it to Holt, who rode out the back of the property through a trail that did not connect to the main road, and who was gone before Purcell's men had finished with the barn. "Y'all." The message came back from Croft in 36 hours, which was faster than she had expected, and told her that he had already been moving. Marsh had agreed. The bank clerk, 24 years old, 3 years into a situation he had not understood when he entered it, and understood all too clearly now, had listened to Croft's presentation of the preliminary evidence for 40 minutes in the back room of a Helena hotel, and then asked very quietly what would happen to him if he helped. Croft had told him the truth, It depended on what he provided and how it was used. But there were people in Helena with federal connections who were interested in the Whitaker operation specifically, and a cooperative witness who came forward voluntarily was in a fundamentally different position than one who was compelled. Marsh had sat with that for a long moment. Then he had said, "The internal ledgers are in the vault. I have access on Monday mornings when I do the weekly reconciliation. The vault is open for approximately 2 hours." Croft's message to Elias said Monday. "We need to be ready Monday." It was currently Friday evening. Amelia read the message twice, folded it, and set it on the table. 3 days, she said. 3 days. Elias agreed. He was pacing, which she had never seen him do. His damaged leg made it uneven, a slight drag, and reset with each turn, and the combination of the unfamiliar movement and the familiar stillness of his face created the impression of a man who was very carefully not showing what he was feeling. "Tell me what you're thinking," she said. He stopped, looked at her. "I'm thinking about everything that can go wrong between now and Monday." "Name one thing," she said. "The most likely one. Whitaker finds out about Marsh before Monday." "How would he find out? He has people watching. He always has people watching." Elias sat down. The inventory today was not just legal compliance. It was a message. He wanted us to see that he could send men to our door. He wanted us to feel the proximity of his reach. "He wanted you to panic," Amelia said. "He wanted you to make a move out of fear so he'd have a reason to escalate." He looked at her. "Yes." "Then we don't move," she said. "We hold exactly where we are until Monday. We do not contact Croft again. We do not change our routine. We do not give anyone watching this property a single thing that looks different from any other, Friday, Saturday, or Sunday on this mountain." He was quiet for a moment. "You're very good at this," he said. "I had a long education in what it looks like when a person tries to make you afraid enough to make a mistake," she said. "Margaret was an excellent teacher. I just wasn't her intended student." Something happened in his face, then something that broke through the careful composure for just a moment and let her see underneath it. It was not pity. It was not admiration exactly. It was something older and more complicated than either the specific expression of a person who recognizes in another person a suffering they know the shape of because they have carried something similar. He looked away before she could examine it too closely. "All right," he said. "We hold." Yesterday. Saturday passed in a careful performance of ordinary life. They did the ranch work. They ate their meals. Holt told a long story about a horse he had known in Texas that had an inexplicable and specific hatred for the color yellow, and it was funny enough that Amelia laughed in a way that felt real and unguarded, and when she looked up from the laughter, she found Elias watching her with an expression she didn't know how to read. Sunday was quieter. She found him in the evening, sitting on the porch steps with a cup of coffee going cold in his hands, and she sat down beside him without asking, because they were past the point where sitting beside each other required permission. "Tell me about Catherine," she said. He looked at the darkness at the edge of the property. "Why? Because I think about her sometimes. Because this was her family's land, and she planted that garden, and this is still her home in a lot of ways." She paused. "And because I think you need to talk about her more than you let yourself." He was quiet for a long time. "She laughed the way you laughed tonight," he said finally. "That's the first thing I thought. When you laughed at Holt's story, she used to laugh like that, like she forgot she was being watched." Amelia did not say anything. "She was the strongest person I knew," he said. "Not in the way that gets celebrated, not in a way that showed. But she watched her family lose everything, and she grieved it properly, and then she got up, and she was still herself. Still kind, still certain." He paused. "I have not always been adequate company for her memory. I have let this house go dark in ways she would not have approved of." "It's not dark anymore," Amelia said. He looked at her. "The garden is growing," she said. "The kitchen table has people around it. Holt is telling stories about horses." She held his gaze. "Whatever you think you owe Catherine, I think she'd want you to let the house be a house again." He was quiet for so long that the cold had worked into her hands by the time he spoke. "You have been here 5 weeks," he said, "and I do not know how to account for the difference." "Don't account for it," she said. "Just let it be." He nodded once, slowly. They sat until the cold made it impractical, and then went inside, and the house was warm and the fire was going, and Monday was coming. Monday arrived with a gray sky and the smell of rain. Elias rode out before dawn. He did not take the main road. He and Croft had arranged a meeting point in the lower valley 3 miles from town, where the river bent and the tree line gave cover, and where Marsh was supposed to deliver copies of the relevant bank records. Not the originals, which would be missed, but copies he had made over the previous week in the 2-hour window of the Monday reconciliation, written in his own careful hand. Amelia stayed on the mountain because someone had to, and because her presence in town on the same morning Elias was moving would draw attention. She worked. She worked the garden, and she fed the animals, and she helped Holt with a repair on the barn door that had been on the list for 2 weeks. She worked because work was the only thing she had ever known how to do when she was afraid, and she was afraid, and she needed it to not show. It was past noon when she heard the horse on the road. One horse, moving fast. She was in the yard when it came through the trees, and it was not Elias, and it was not Croft. It was Denny Marsh. He was younger than she had imagined, barely older than herself, with dark hair and a face that had gone white to the lips, and the expression of a man who had just done the most frightening thing he had ever done, and was not sure if he had survived it. He pulled up in the yard and half fell from the saddle, and she was there before he'd fully found his feet. "Where's Elias?" she asked. "Where's Croft?" "They're coming," he said. His voice was shaking. "I had to move early. Whitaker came in this morning. He wasn't supposed to be there on Monday. He never comes in on Monday. But he came in and he went straight to the vault room, and He stopped, breathed. "I had already made the copies. I had them on me. If he'd found them. But he didn't," she said. "No, I got out. I told the other clerk I was sick, which wasn't a lie, and I got out." He looked at her. The shaking was not quite stopping. "But he'll know. When he looks at the reconciliation, the things I copied, the things I noted, he'll know someone was in those records." "How long before he realizes?" she asked. "Hours," Marsh said. "Maybe by end of day." She looked at him. He was barely holding himself together. Not out of weakness, she understood, but out of the particular aftermath of genuine courage which is often indistinguishable from falling apart. "Come inside," she said. "Sit down." She got him inside and got coffee in front of him, and sat across the table and said, "Give me the documents." He looked at her. Are you Amelia Whitmore?" "Yes." Something shifted in his face. "Croft told me about you, about the Whitmore accounts." He reached inside his coat and removed a folded packet of papers carefully wrapped. "He said if anything went wrong and I needed to get to safety, I was to come here." She took the packet. "You did the right thing," she said. "What you did took considerable courage." He looked at her with the slightly disoriented expression of someone who has been told what they just did required courage and has not yet processed whether they agree. I couldn't keep watching it," he said. "I knew what was in those books. I knew what the numbers meant. And I kept telling myself it wasn't my business. It wasn't my fault. I was just doing my job." He stopped. "But at some point that stops being true. At some point you know too much to pretend you don't know it." "I know," Amelia said. "Believe me, I know exactly what that point feels like." She opened the packet and looked at the first page. The numbers were clear. The hand was careful and exact. And what they said, the pattern they described, laid out in Denny Marsh's precise handwriting drawn from Whitaker's own internal ledgers, was worse and more comprehensive than she had dared to hope. She was still reading when she heard horses on the road. 2 this time. She did not move from the table, because what she was holding in her hands was the thing they had been building toward for weeks, and she was not going to stop reading it. Elias came through the door with Croft behind him, and they both saw Marsh at the table and the documents in Amelia's hands, and Elias's expression moved through several things very quickly. Relief assessment. The particular controlled alarm of a man who is counting the ways the timeline has changed. He got out early, Amelia said. She did not look up. Whitaker came in unexpectedly. Marsh moved before they made contact. She turned a page. Elias? What? She looked up. There are 14 families in here. Names, dates, amounts, transaction references. She held his gaze. 14 families who lost their land to Whitaker's operation through Harwick and Associates with the complete internal documentation linking each transaction to the originating decision in this bank. She turned the page again, and on the last page, she stopped. He crossed the room in 3 steps, damaged leg and all, and looked over her shoulder at the page she was pointing to. His breath went out of him in a way she felt more than heard. Thomas Whitmore, she said very quietly. My father's estate, right here in Whitaker's own records. She placed her finger on the line. The claim against the estate, the undocumented loan, the payment made to Whitaker through Margaret within the month. She looked up at Elias. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't an opportunity he stumbled into. He knew about my father's will. He knew about my trust. He engineered the claim against the estate specifically to get access to those funds before I could claim them. The kitchen was very still. He planned it, she said. From the beginning, Croft spoke from the doorway. Then we have everything we need. Amelia looked at the documents in her hands, at the names of 14 families, at her father's name written in a dead man's bank records as evidence of a theft that had been committed against his daughter before she was old enough to understand what was being taken. She felt something she had not felt before. It was not the cold anger she had cultivated carefully over the past weeks, the controlled and purposeful thing that had kept her functional. It was something older and hotter and more fundamental. The specific blazing clarity of a person who has been told for years that they were imagining things, that they were wrong, that the world was simply as it was, and they had best make peace with it, and who is now holding in their hands the undeniable proof that they were not wrong. They were never wrong. They were just alone. She set the documents on the table. She straightened them carefully. What do we do next? She asked, and her voice did not shake even once. Croft spread the documents across the kitchen table and did not speak for a long time. He read the way lawyers read, not consuming words, but interrogating them, moving back and forth between pages, cross-referencing entries, building the architecture of what they had in his mind, before he said a single thing out loud. Marsh sat at the far end of the table, with his second cup of coffee, and his hands wrapped around it, like it was the only warm thing in the world. Holt stood near the door, with the particular stillness of a man who has learned that in rooms where important things are being decided, the most useful thing you can be is present and quiet. Elias stood by the window. Amelia sat at the table and watched Croft read and kept her hands flat on the surface in front of her because keeping them flat was a conscious act, and conscious acts were what she had available to her right now. Finally, Croft set down the last page. This is sufficient, he said. Not merely sufficient, this is comprehensive. The internal ledger entries link 14 land transactions to originating decisions made at Whitaker's direction. The Harwick connection is explicit. The firm is named as the purchasing vehicle in 3 separate entries, with notations in Whitaker's own hand. He looked at Marsh. These annotations, the initials in the margin, those are Whitaker's. Yes, sir, Marsh said. I've seen his initialing process every week for 3 years. That's him. And the Whitmore entry, the estate claim. Croft looked at Amelia. This is the clearest piece. The entry describes the claim amount, the basis, the fictitious loan, and the intended use. The funds were to be redirected to a secondary account at Harwick before the probate process could establish your legal claim. He paused. Someone in Whitaker's organization knew about the will, knew about the trust provision, knew that if the probate process ran its natural course, you would receive your inheritance at 18. He looked at the document again. The claim against the estate was manufactured specifically to extract those funds before that could happen. The room received that statement in silence. Someone told him about the will, Elias said. Not a question. The will was registered, Amelia said slowly. Judge Price has the registration, but the reading of the will... She stopped. Whitaker was at the reading. He was there. He heard every word. And then he manufactured a debt within the month, Croft said. Margaret paid it, Amelia said. But if she was already in his network by then, if she was already receiving payments from Harwick... She looked at the ledgers she'd brought from Fincher's store. Can we establish when she first received a Harwick payment relative to my father's death? Croft looked at the household ledgers. He found the first Harwick entry. He looked at the date. 6 weeks after your father died, he said. The number sat in the room. She was recruited, Amelia said, quietly. While she was still in mourning, or what passed for it. She thought about Margaret's composed face at the funeral, her practical efficiency in the weeks that followed, the speed with which she had closed off any questions about the estate. He offered her an arrangement, a way to profit from her position, and she took it. While telling you there was nothing for you, Elias said. His voice was very controlled. While telling me there was nothing for me, she agreed. She was not going to cry. She had made that decision somewhere in the last 30 seconds without quite noticing it. The grief was there, not sharp and new, but old and thick. The grief of understanding a thing you had always half known, but never been able to prove, and she sat with it and did not let it move her face. All right, she said. What do we do with what we have? Croft laid it out with the precision of a man who had been building toward this moment for 2 years and had the patience to do it right even now that the end was in sight. The documents from Marsh were copies, not originals. That was the first limitation. In a territorial court where Whitaker had influence, copies made by a bank clerk could be challenged. The clerk's credibility attacked the copying process, questioned the chain of custody, disputed. Copies were evidence, but they were not ironclad. What made them ironclad was federal jurisdiction. There are 2 things in here that open a federal door, Croft said. The first is the mail. At least 3 of the transactions show correspondence conducted through postal routes between Whitaker's operation here and the Harwick principals in Helena. Using the mail to conduct fraud is a federal offense, and federal jurisdiction removes this from any local court where Whitaker has relationships. He looked at Elias. The second is the Caldwell land. Elias went very still. The Caldwell property. This property was originally acquired under a homestead claim filed with the Federal Land Office, Croft said. The manner in which that claim was manipulated to create the debt that displaced the family may constitute fraud against the federal government's land grant process, which is also federal. He set down the papers. If I can get these documents to the federal marshal's office in Helena by end of week, we bypass Purcell, we bypass the county court, and we bypass every judge in this territory who owes Whitaker anything. How fast can the federal office move? Elias asked. Faster than Whitaker expects, Croft said. Particularly if I arrive with evidence this complete. He paused. There's one more thing. The affidavit against Miss Whitmore, the one Margaret filed with the county court, characterizing her as a woman of compromised judgment. He looked at Amelia directly. A coordinated affidavit filed by a party who is herself documented as a participant in the fraud. It was designed to suppress that obstruction. It makes Margaret Whitmore not just a peripheral figure in this, but an active legal liability. She filed that affidavit to protect her own position, Amelia said. Yes, and in doing so, she drew herself further into this than she may have understood. Croft gathered the documents carefully and began organizing them into the leather bag he'd brought. Miss Whitmore, I want to be honest with you about something. She met his eyes. This process, even with federal involvement, will not be fast. It will not be clean. Whitaker will fight this with every resource he has, and he has considerable resources. The deed challenge will likely remain in place for some months while the larger matter is investigated. You and Vance will be under pressure during that time, legal, social, possibly physical. He held her gaze. Are you prepared for that? She thought about what she'd been prepared for before she came to this mountain. She thought about 6 years of being told she was nothing about standing in a town square with a suitcase while her stepmother smiled at a stranger. She thought about Denny Marsh riding through the trees with his face white and his hands shaking because he had done the right thing anyway. Yes, she said. Croft nodded once, as though that was the answer he'd expected, and he'd been waiting to hear it confirmed. Good. Croft left for Helena that evening with Marsh beside him, and the house settled into a kind of silence that was not empty, but full of the weight of what had been set in motion, and the knowledge that the next move was not theirs to make. Holt went to bed early, which was his custom. Elias and Amelia sat by the fire with coffee, and for a long time neither of them said anything, and the quiet between them was the kind that does not need filling. It was Elias who spoke first. "How are you?" he asked, not as a pleasantry. She considered the question with the seriousness it was offered. "I don't quite know," she said. "I know what I feel about what happened, about my father's estate, about Margaret, about all of it. I've known the general shape of it for a while now. But seeing it written down in someone else's records, in someone else's handwriting." She paused. "It makes it real in a different way. Like it was one thing to suspect you've been robbed, and another thing to see the accounting of exactly how it was done. Does it help?" he asked. "Knowing it precisely?" "Yes," she said. "It does. Because it means it wasn't my fault. It means I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't ungrateful. I wasn't too difficult or too demanding, or not quite good enough in some way I could have fixed if I'd just tried harder." She looked at the fire. "It means the story I told myself for 6 years, that I was the problem, was a story someone else wrote, and I can put it down." He was quiet for a moment. "I told myself a story too," he said, "after Catherine died. That I was supposed to live up here alone, that the world I'd been part of, the valley, the town people in general, had made its judgment of me, and I'd made my peace with that." He turned the cup in his hands. "I'd gotten very comfortable with my version of what I was supposed to be." "And now?" she asked. He looked at her. "Now I'm not sure it was ever true," he said. "I think I decided to believe it because it was easier than hoping for something different." She held his gaze for a moment. The fire cracked and sent up a small shower of sparks. "That," she said softly, "is something I understand completely." Wednesday brought a rider she hadn't seen before. He appeared mid-morning on a horse that had been ridden hard and carried a message addressed to Elias in a handwriting she recognized from the envelopes that had been arriving since the deed challenge was filed. County court handwriting, formal and dense. Elias read it twice, folded it, put it in his coat. "What is it?" she asked. "The deed challenge hearing has been accelerated," he said. "Originally scheduled for 6 weeks out. They've moved it to Friday." "Friday," she repeated. "That's 2 days." "Yes." She worked it through. "Whitaker knows Marsh ran. He knows the records were copied. He's trying to get to the judge before Croft gets to the federal office." She looked at Elias. "If the county court rules against the deed on Friday, does that affect what Croft is doing?" "Not legally," he said. "Federal jurisdiction would supersede a county ruling, but practically—" He paused. "A county court ruling in Whitaker's favor, even a temporary one, gives him grounds to act on the property preservation order, which means he could potentially have Purcell enforce a formal restriction that makes it very difficult for us to operate the ranch while the federal matter is pending." He met her eyes. "It's a pressure tactic. He wants to squeeze hard enough that something breaks." "Will something break?" "Not on my end," he said. "Then we need someone at that hearing," she said. "We need someone who can challenge the proceeding, slow it down, make it expensive for Whitaker to rush it." "Price," Elias said. "Judge Price." She nodded. "He has the registration of my father's will. He has knowledge of the county records. If he appears at that hearing with documentation connecting the estate irregularities to Whitaker, the presiding judge can't simply ignore it. She paused. Would he do it? I think he might, Elias said. I think Harlan Price has been watching this valley for a very long time and has been waiting for someone to give him a reason to act on what he's seen. He was already moving toward the barn. I'll go today, he said. I'll be back by nightfall. Be careful in town, she said. He stopped and turned back and looked at her, a brief, direct look that carried more in it than either of them was quite ready to say out loud yet. Always, he said. He was not back by nightfall. By 8 o'clock the fire was low, and Holt had checked the road twice, and Amelia had done the dishes and dried them and put them away, and then did them again because she needed something to do with her hands. At 8:30, she heard the horse. She was outside before the sound had fully registered, standing on the porch in the cold, and she watched Elias come through the trees, moving slower than she'd expected, and with the particular careful way a man moves when something hurts. She was down the porch steps before she'd made the decision to move. What happened? She asked. I'm all right, he said. That's not what I asked. He dismounted, and she could see in the low light that his coat was torn at the shoulder, and there was something dark along his jaw that might have been dirt, or might have been blood. There were 2 men at the edge of town, he said. On the road back. They were waiting. Her hands moved to his arm without asking permission. You're hurt. It's not serious. He let her look. The darkness on his jaw was blood, not a lot of cut, but he was moving stiffly in a way that suggested his ribs had been involved. I've had considerably worse. Did you see Price? I saw Price. He'll be at the hearing Friday morning. He let her steer him toward the house with more compliance than he would have offered an hour ago, which told her the injury was real, even if he was minimizing it. He was already prepared. He had more than I expected. He's been quietly documenting the deed challenge filings for weeks, cross-referencing them against county records. He said this was not the first time Whitaker had tried to accelerate a proceeding to outrun inconvenient evidence. Who were the men on the road? She asked. She got him inside and pushed him into a chair. I don't know. Hired? He winced when she touched his shoulder. They weren't trying to kill me. It was a warning. A warning to do what? Stay home Friday. He looked at her. Not attend the hearing. Are you going to stay home Friday? No. He said it with a flatness that did not leave room for any other answer. She cleaned the cut on his jaw with the efficiency of someone who had spent years managing practical problems alone and did not have the luxury of being squeamish about it. He sat still for it, which told her he trusted her hands, which told her something she filed away carefully for later consideration. Holt should ride to Price tonight, she said. Warn him that the pressure is escalating. If Whitaker sent men to intercept you on the road, he may try something with Price directly. I already thought of that, Elias said. I asked Price to stay at the hotel in town Thursday night, safer than his house. Good. She finished with the cut and stepped back. What else do you need? He looked up at her, and for a moment, the careful composure came completely undone. Not dramatically, not in any way that was visible to someone who didn't know how to read him. But she knew how to read him now, and she saw the tiredness and something beneath the tiredness that was neither defeat nor despair, but the very specific weight of a man who has been alone with something too big for one person for too long. Nothing, he said. I just need to sit here for a minute. She sat down across from him. Not close, just present. That was all he'd asked for. It was enough. Thursday was the longest day she had spent on the mountain. The waiting had a different quality than it had before. Heavier, more textured, the way the air changes before a storm that has been building for hours. She felt Whitaker's pressure not as a dramatic force, but as the slow increase of a weight that had been placed on them, carefully distributed, so no single point felt unbearable, but cumulative and real. She did not sit still. She wrote letters. She wrote to Croft a brief and careful update on the hearing acceleration and on Elias's encounter on the road, and had Holt take it to the postal station in the early morning before anyone was watching the road. She wrote to Amos Fincher, asking him to be at the county courthouse on Friday morning and to bring his own copy of the household reconciliation ledgers. She did not explain why. She trusted that Fincher, who had looked at her in that back room with the expression of a man doing a very late accounting of his own failures, would come. She also wrote for the first time to the 14 families named in Marsh's documents. That took most of the afternoon. She wrote each letter individually, not a form, each one acknowledged. The specific family, the specific property, the specific loss, the specific year. She did not promise anything. She was careful about that, because promising things she could not guarantee was something other people had done to her, and she had no intention of doing it to anyone else. She said only, "Your situation has not been forgotten. There are people who know what happened, and there are proceedings underway that may affect your claim. You may wish to speak with someone who can advise you of your legal options." 14 letters, 14 families, 14 sets of losses that had been made invisible because the people who'd engineered them were very good at making things invisible. She sealed the last one and stacked them in a pile. Elias came in and saw the pile and picked up the topmost letter and read the name on it. "Caldwell," he said. "I thought they should know," she said. "Even if nothing comes of the hearing, even if everything takes longer than we hope, they should know that their situation is documented, that someone looked at what happened to them and wrote it down." He set the letter back on the stack very carefully. "Catherine's brother," he said. "He moved to Billings after the family lost the land. I've thought about writing to him for years." He paused. "I never did." "Why not?" He was quiet for a moment. "Guilt," he said. "I bought the land ultimately from the man Whitaker sold it to. Even though I bought it fair and the intention was to preserve it, I always felt that telling him would be more for my benefit than his. And now he needs to know," Elias said. "Now it serves him, not me." He looked at the letter. "May I add something to it?" She pushed it toward him. He sat down and wrote 2 sentences at the bottom of the page in his careful, compressed handwriting, and she did not read over his shoulder. When he was done, he set down the pen and looked at what he'd written for a moment, and she could see the cost of it on his face. Not regret, but the particular expression of a person doing a long overdue right thing, and then he folded the letter and handed it back to her. Friday morning arrived cold and clear. They drove to Raven Creek in the wagon, Elias and Amelia and Holt, and the road through the pine forest was very quiet, and the silence among the 3 of them was not the silence of people who have nothing to say, but of people who have already said what matters, and are now moving through the world with their minds made up. Raven Creek was awake earlier than usual. Amelia noticed it as they came down the main road. More horses tied at the posts than a Friday morning warranted clusters of people outside the general store and the post office. The particular electric quality of a small town that has sensed something is happening. Word had traveled. She was not surprised. Word always traveled in places like Raven Creek, and Whitaker had been a large enough fact in the valley for long enough that anything touching his position sent ripples through every part of the community. She recognized some of the faces as they passed. She saw former neighbors, people who had watched her grow up, people who had been present in the town square the morning her stepmother handed her off and had looked away or watched with a kind of detached pity. She did not look away from any of them. She sat straight on the wagon seat and looked at the town that had defined her smallness for 6 years, and she felt neither anger at it nor need for its validation, which was a new and extraordinarily solid feeling. Judge Price was already at the courthouse. He was standing outside the building with a leather briefcase and the expression of a man who has been waiting for this particular morning for longer than he will say. And when he saw Elias, he reached out and shook hands with the grip of someone who means it. And when he looked at Amelia, he said very simply, "You have done very well, young woman." And it landed without the condescension that similar sentences had always carried from other people, because it was not a compliment. It was a statement of fact from a man who had been watching carefully. "What are we walking into?" Elias asked. "Judge Franklin Morse is presiding," Price said. "He is not Whitaker's man specifically, but he is a man who is careful about his relationships, and Whitaker has relationships with everyone." He adjusted his briefcase. "However, I have filed documentation this morning with the court as an interested party in the Whitmore estate matter, which connects the deed challenge before Morse to ongoing questions about the administration of a registered will in his county. He cannot simply ignore that connection without putting his own conduct on record." "Whitaker will object," Elias said. "Whitaker will object to everything," Price said. "That is what Whitaker does. But there are witnesses present today. I made certain of it. Several of the families affected by his operations are in attendance, and Mr. Fincher has arrived." He glanced toward the courthouse steps, and Amelia followed his gaze to see Amos Fincher standing with his hat in his hands and the household ledgers under his arm, looking like a man who has finally decided which side of something he is on. She looked at Fincher. He looked at her. He gave a small, uncharacteristic nod. She nodded back. "Then we go in," she said. The courtroom was already half full. She had not been inside the Raven Creek courthouse before. It was a long, plain room with bench seating and a raised desk at the front where Judge Morse sat with the compressed patience of a man who had been informed his morning was going to be complicated and had accepted that information without enthusiasm. Whitaker was already there. She had seen him before at a distance in town, the particular figure of a man whose prosperity is visible in the way he takes up space. But she had never been in the same room with him, and the experience of being in the same room with him was clarifying in the way that direct confrontation often is. He was a large man, well-dressed, with the particular self-possession of someone who has not been seriously opposed in a long time. He sat at one side of the room with his attorney, a polished Helena man named Greer, who had the look of a professional weapon. Whitaker looked at Elias when they came in with the expression of a man who had expected them not to appear. Then he looked at Amelia. Something shifted in his face very briefly. Very fast gone before most people in the room would have caught it. She caught it. She had spent 6 years reading Margaret Whitmore's face for exactly these micro-adjustments, these fractional expressions that passed too quickly to name, but that told you everything about what was happening beneath the surface. What she saw in Whitaker's face in that half-second was not anger. It was reassessment. He had expected she understood to be dealing with a frightened girl and a damaged recluse, and a problem that had gotten larger than intended, but that was still fundamentally manageable. He had sent men to the mountain to intimidate them. He had accelerated the hearing to outrun Croft's federal approach. He had filed Margaret's affidavit to discredit the most inconvenient witness. What he was seeing instead was a woman who had driven 4 hours from a mountain and walked into his courtroom and sat down without hesitation and looked at him across the room without flinching. That was a different problem. She held his gaze for exactly 1 second and then looked away because she had made her point and she did not need to belabor it. The hearing began. Whitaker's attorney Greer moved through the deed challenge arguments with practiced efficiency, technical questions about the chain of title, the original homestead claim. A gap in the documentation of one transfer that he argued constituted a defect requiring court resolution. He was good. He was very good. He presented the challenge as a straightforward legal matter, bloodless and procedural, completely disconnected from any of the context that gave it its actual meaning. Price's counter was measured and precise. He did not attempt to introduce the Marsh documents. Croft had been explicit that those were being reserved for the federal proceeding, where they would land with far greater force. Instead, Price focused on the estate connection, presenting the record of Thomas Whitmore's registered will, the documentation of the trust provision, and the filing anomalies that suggested the trust had never been properly administered. He argued that the same patterns of documentary irregularity present in the estate matter were present in the deed challenge, and that the connection was sufficient grounds to delay any ruling until both matters could be examined together. Greer objected to everything. Judge Morse listened to both with the expression of a man who is doing math in his head that has nothing to do with what he is hearing. And then Amos Fincher asked to address the court. Greer objected immediately. Mr. Fincher is a merchant with no legal standing in this proceeding. Greer said. Mr. Fincher, Price said carefully, holds business records that are directly relevant to the estate matter I have placed before this court. As that matter has been formally introduced as connected to this preceding documentation that illuminates the estate connection is material. Morse looked at Fincher. What do you have, Mr. Fincher? Fincher came forward with his ledgers and set them on the rail before the judge's desk, and said in the slow, careful voice of a man who has rehearsed his sentence many times, because he knows it matters. I have 6 years of reconciled household accounts for the Whitmore estate, Your Honor, including payments to a firm called Harwick and Associates that were recorded as household expenses, but that I have since come to understand represent something quite different. The courtroom was very quiet. Whitaker's stillness had the quality of a man controlling a physical reaction. I also have, Fincher said, a clear memory of being present at the reading of Thomas Whitmore's will, and of hearing Charles Whitaker present a claim against that estate within 3 weeks of that reading, and of that claim being paid without documentation of the original obligation, and of thinking at the time that something was wrong and saying nothing. He paused. I am saying something now. Greer was on his feet. Your Honor, this is completely irregular. This man has not been sworn. He has no legal standing. I will be sworn, Fincher said. Right now, if the court requires it. I have nothing I am not prepared to say under oath. Morse looked at Whitaker's attorney for a long moment. Then he looked at Whitaker. Whitaker's face was composed. His hands were flat on the table. But his attorney leaned over and said something in his ear, and Whitaker's jaw tightened by a fraction that Amelia, who was watching, did not miss. I'm going to call a recess, Morse said. The recess lasted 40 minutes. In the hallway, people talked in low voices and watch each other, the specific social electricity of a community in the process of rearranging itself. Several people approached Elias, whom she had never seen speak to him before, men who had nods for him. Quiet words, the particular overture of people who are reassessing a position they'd held too long without examining it. One woman came to Amelia. She was in her 50s with a face that had been worked hard by weather and worry, and she held her coat collar closed with one hand and looked at Amelia with an expression that was part recognition and part something more complicated. I knew your father, she said. Thomas Whitmore was a good man. He loaned us seed money in '68 when the harvest failed, no interest, no formal arrangement. Just because we needed it. She paused. I watched your stepmother stand in the square and tell the town you were someone else's problem. I watched, and I didn't say anything, and I've thought about that since. She held out her hand. My name is Vera Halloran. My family lost our farm in '78. Whitaker's Bank. Amelia shook her hand. I know, she said. Your name is in the documents. Vera Halloran's face moved. You have documents. The Federal Marshal's office in Helena will have them by end of week, Amelia said. I cannot promise you a specific outcome, but your situation is documented, and the documentation is in the right hands. The woman stood for a moment with something shifting in her face that was very old and very tired, and then briefly something else. Thank you, she said. It was a small sentence, and it carried a great deal, correct. When the court reconvened, Judge Morse made an announcement that nobody in the room had expected. He was not ruling on the deed challenge. He was staying the proceeding pending the outcome of an inquiry he was formally requesting from the county's probate records office regarding the administration of the Whitmore estate. He cited the connection Price had established between the estate irregularities and the chain of title questions in the deed challenge, and he stated that it would be improper to adjudicate one matter without clarifying the other. Greer argued with force and considerable volume. Morse looked at him over his glasses with the expression of a man who has made up his mind and does not find repetition persuasive. The stay is in place, he said. This court is adjourned. The room erupted. Not loudly, this was a Montana courthouse in 1882. Not a theatrical venue, but in the particular rush of many people beginning to speak to each other at once, the sound of a community processing a reversal it had not anticipated. Whitaker stood up from his table. He looked across the room directly at Elias. It was a long look, deliberate and open, The kind of look that does not need words because it is itself a communication. It said, "This is not over." Elias looked back at him with the same quiet he brought to everything. The same composed stillness that had once led people in Raven Creek to call it coldness, and call him dangerous and cross the street when they saw him coming. It was not coldness. Amelia knew that now. It was the specific expression of a man who has nothing to hide and nothing to prove, and is simply straightforwardly not afraid. He held Whitaker's gaze for 3 full seconds. Then he turned away, because Whitaker's gaze was not worth more of his time than that. It was outside the courthouse in the cold, bright air of the Friday morning that the second twist arrived. It arrived in the form of a woman in a dark coat who had been standing at the edge of the crowd that had gathered outside the building, and who came forward as Amelia and Elias came through the door, and whom Amelia recognized in the first half-second with a physical sensation that was not quite shock, because she had been prepared for this eventually, but that still moved through her like ice water. Margaret Whitmore. She was not the composed, precise woman she had been in the town square 5 weeks ago. She was wearing the same quality of clothing, but it sat differently on her, as though the confidence that usually animated it had been replaced with something that pulled it down. Her face was controlled in the way of a person maintaining control at the edge of their capacity. She looked at Amelia. "I need to speak with you," she said. The crowd around them had gone very quiet. "There's nothing you need to say to me in public," Amelia said. Her voice was even. "I need to say something," Margaret said. "Please." The word was unusual on her. It sat wrong like something she was not practiced at. "Not here, somewhere private." Elias beside Amelia had gone very still. He did not move toward Margaret, and he did not move to stop the conversation. He simply stood there and let Amelia decide. She looked at Margaret for a long moment. 5 minutes, she said. "Right here. Whatever you have to say, you can say it quickly." Margaret looked around at the watching crowd. Her jaw tightened. "The bank," she said. "Whitaker's people came to me this morning before the hearing. They told me that if the federal proceeding moves forward, the documentation will show my name in connection with the Harwick payments." She held Amelia's gaze. "They wanted me to make a statement, a formal affidavit supporting Whitaker's position on the deed challenge, corroborating the claim about your state of mind. And," Amelia said. "I didn't sign it," Margaret said. The words landed in the crowd. Amelia looked at her. The woman who had told her for 6 years she was nothing. The woman who had taken her inheritance and paid it to a man who manufactured debts against grieving widows. The woman who had stood in a town square and smiled at a stranger and called her daughter a problem that was now someone else's. "Why not?" Amelia asked. Margaret was quiet for a moment. "Because I know what I did," she said. "I know what I took. And I can tell myself reasons and explanations all I want, but I know what I did, and there is a point at which adding more onto it." She stopped. "I am not a good woman," she said, "but I am not going to be his instrument against my own stepdaughter to save myself." It was the most honest thing Amelia had ever heard her say. She stood with it for a long moment. "If you want to undo some of what you've done," Amelia said carefully, "the people who need to hear what you know are in Helena, not here. If you want to talk to Croft, the man working with the federal office, I can arrange it." Margaret looked at her. Something moved in her face. Not gratitude exactly, which would have been too large and too clean, but something smaller and more ambiguous. The expression of a person who has been offered a door they did not expect. "I'll consider it," she said. Amelia nodded once. Margaret turned and walked away through the crowd. Elias watched her go, and then looked at Amelia. "Are you all right?" he asked. She thought about it honestly. "Yes," she said. "I am." She breathed in the cold morning air. I didn't want an apology from her. I don't think I need one. What I wanted was the truth, and I have it. She looked up at him. "The truth is enough." He looked at her for a moment, with that expression she had come to know, the one that lived beneath all his composure, the one she'd first glimpsed by firelight weeks ago, and that had grown gradually and without announcement, into something she no longer tried to look away from. "You are," he said quietly, "one of the most remarkable people I have ever known." She did not deflect it. She did not minimize it. She looked at him and received the sentence exactly as it was given, not a compliment from a man to a woman because politeness required it, but a true thing said plainly by a person who did not say untrue things. "Thank you," she said. Behind them, the crowd of Raven Creek talked and moved and began its slow rearrangement. Vera Halloran stood with two other women whose names Amelia did not yet know, but whose faces she had last seen in Marsh's documents beside the dates of their losses. Amos Fincher stood with his ledgers and the posture of a man who has set a weight down. Judge Price came out through the courthouse door and caught Elias's eye and gave a small decisive nod, and in the distance, Charles Whitaker's carriage moved down the main road away from the courthouse, and it did not stop. Not fleeing, not yet. Men like Whitaker did not flee so simply. But moving, recalculating, understanding for the first time that the mountain he had dismissed as a minor obstacle in his 12-year project was in fact the place where everything he had built was going to come undone. Amelia watched the carriage go. She had spent 5 weeks on that mountain learning what it felt like to be treated as a person rather than a problem. She had spent those same 5 weeks building something slowly practically out of ledger books and legal filings and late-night conversations by the fire that was aimed at exactly this moment. It had not ended. Croft was in Helena. The federal process would take months. Margaret might cooperate or might not. Whitaker would fight with everything he had. But something had shifted today that did not unshift. Something had been said publicly in a court of law in front of the people of Raven Creek that could not be unsaid. The girl who had been handed off as someone else's problem had walked into that courthouse and stood her ground and walked back out. And the mountain man that everyone in this town had spent 7 years being afraid of had stood beside her and let her lead because he understood the way he understood most things quietly, and without needing it, explained that she did not need protecting. She needed witnesses. And he had been the first. The letter from Croft arrived on a Tuesday 3 weeks after the courthouse hearing, and it was thicker than any letter that had come before it. Elias brought it in from the road and set it on the kitchen table without opening it, and he and Amelia looked at it for a moment, the way people look at things that are going to change. Something not with fear exactly, but with the particular weight of a moment that has been building for a long time and has finally arrived at its own front door. She picked it up and opened it. Croft had written 6 pages in his compressed, precise hand, and she read them through once quickly, and then went back to the beginning and read them again slowly, because the first reading had moved too fast for her to hold all of it. The federal marshal's office in Helena had accepted the case, not as a civil matter, as a criminal investigation. The mail fraud provisions had opened the federal door exactly as Croft had anticipated, and once that door was open, the scope of what the investigation revealed had expanded beyond even what Marsh's documents had suggested. There were connections to operations in 2 other Montana counties. There were transactions that reached back further than 1876. There were names in the federal records that were not Whitaker's name, but that pointed back to his operation like roads pointing to a hub. Margaret Whitmore had gone to Helena. That was on page 3, stated plainly, without commentary. She had presented herself voluntarily to Croft's contact at the federal office and had provided a sworn statement covering everything she knew about her arrangement with Whitaker, beginning with the conversation that had taken place within the week of Thomas Whitmore's death and extending through every payment she had received from Harwick and Associates in the years that followed. She had named names. She had provided dates. She had been, Croft wrote, in the particular dry language of a man who is careful with his assessments, remarkably forthcoming. Her cooperation would be considered in the determination of her own liability. Croft did not speculate about outcomes. He noted only that the decision to come forward voluntarily with full documentation before being compelled by subpoena was the best available option, and that she appeared to understand that. Amelia read that section twice. She did not know how to feel about Margaret, and she had decided some weeks ago to stop pressing herself to resolve it. Margaret had done real and lasting harm. She had also, at a moment when it would have been easier and safer not to refuse to do more. Both things were true, and neither one canceled the other out, and carrying them both without needing them to resolve into a simpler shape was something Amelia was learning to do. She moved on to page 4. Charles Whitaker had been served a federal summons on the previous Thursday. He had not fled. She had half expected him to flee. Men of his type, in her experience, had a well-developed instinct for self-preservation that generally expressed itself as mobility when things went wrong. But Whitaker had stayed. He had retained 3 attorneys from Helena and issued a statement through them declaring the investigation politically motivated and legally baseless, which was the language of a man who was frightened and had decided that the best performance of confidence was its most aggressive version. It would not help him. The documents were too complete. Croft's last paragraph addressed the property directly. The deed challenge had been formally withdrawn not by court order, but by Whitaker's own attorneys quietly without announcement, because pursuing a deed challenge while the subject of a federal fraud investigation was the kind of visibility that even Whitaker's lawyers could not justify. The county court's stay was dissolved. The property preservation order was lifted. The land was Elias's, cleanly, completely without condition. Amelia set the letter down. "Tell me," Elias said. He had been watching her face while she read, because watching her face while she read had become the most efficient way to understand what a document contained. She told him. She went through it methodically, page by page, the way she went through ledgers, starting at the beginning, not skipping to the conclusion, giving each piece its proper weight. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things about him she had come to count on so completely that she sometimes forgot it was a choice he made. When she finished, the kitchen was very quiet. "It's done," he said. "The investigation isn't done," she said. "That will take months, maybe longer." "No," he said. "I mean, the thing we were fighting is done. Whatever comes next is consequences, not combat. Whitaker's lost the ability to threaten anyone with anything. The investigation is someone else's work now." He paused. "What we did is done." She understood what he meant. She picked up the letter again and looked at the last page where Croft had added a postscript in a slightly different ink, suggesting he had written it separately from the main letter, perhaps later, perhaps after more thought. It said, "I have filed the preliminary documentation with the probate court regarding the Whitmore estate. The process of establishing what was taken and what can be recovered will take time, but the standing is clear. Miss Whitmore's claim is recognized. Someone will be in touch." She folded the letter carefully. "My father's estate," she said. "Yes," Elias said. "It won't be everything. Whatever was taken, some of it is spent, some of it is gone." Margaret put it into Whitaker's network, and it moved through a dozen transactions. She was realistic about this. She had been realistic about it since the beginning. "But some of it will come back." "What will you do with it?" he asked, not possessively, not with any implication about what she should do. Just the question. She thought about it. She had thought about it before in the abstract, in the way you think about things you want without being sure you're allowed to want them. But now it was concrete, and she could afford to look at it directly. "I want to help the 14 families," she said. "I know the legal process will work on that separately. But there are things the legal process doesn't cover: the years of lost income, the cost of having to start over somewhere else, the things that can't be itemized in a court filing." She looked at him. "If I have resources, I want to use some of them for that." He nodded. "That's a good thing to do." "And I want to stay here," she said. She said it plainly, the way she had learned to say the things that mattered, without softening them into questions, without embedding them in conditions, without making them easier for the other person to dismiss by making them small. She had been making herself small for 6 years, and she had stopped doing it, and she was not going to start again even for this. "On the mountain," she said. "If that's—" She stopped because she had said she wasn't going to soften it, and here she was softening it. She straightened. "I want to stay on the mountain." Elias looked at her across the kitchen table. "Amelia," he said. "Yes, I have been trying," he said carefully, "to find the right moment to say something to you for approximately 3 weeks. And I have not found it, which is unusual for me because I am generally not a man who has difficulty saying what he means." He paused. "I think the difficulty is that what I mean is something I have not permitted myself to mean for a long time, and saying it out loud makes it real in a way that—" He stopped again. "Elias," she said. "Yes. Just say it." He looked at her with the expression she had first seen by firelight weeks ago, and had been watching grow gradually and without announcement into the clearest thing in her daily life. "I don't want you to stay because you have nowhere else to go," he said. "I want you to stay because you want to be here, because this is the place you choose." He held her gaze with the directness that was one of the most consistent things about him. "And I want you to know that if you stay, if you choose to stay, I am not offering you a position or a roof or a practical arrangement. I am telling you that this is your home, that you are not a guest in it, that the reason I want you here is not what you contribute to the functioning of this ranch." He paused. "It's you. It's just you." She sat with that. She sat with it the way she had learned to sit with important things without rushing toward a response, without deflecting, without immediately translating it into something more manageable. She let it be as large as it was. "When I came here," she said, "I thought I was surviving. I thought the best I could do was find a place where I was tolerated and make myself useful enough to justify taking up space." She looked at him. "You made that impossible. Not by doing anything dramatic, just by treating me like a person consistently without expecting anything back. And I didn't know what to do with that at first because I had no reference point for it." "And now," he said. "Now I know what to do with it," she said. "Now I know it's what I want. Not a position, not a roof, not a practical arrangement." She met his eyes. "You, this house, this mountain, this life." She paused. "I choose it. Completely." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Not a dramatic gesture, not the kind of thing you would describe at length. Just his hand over hers, warm and certain the way everything he did was certain, because he had thought about it before he did it, and he meant it completely. She turned her hand over and held on. The first of the families came to the mountain in May. It was the Hallorans, Vera and her husband James, and their 2 grown sons driving up the road in a wagon with a basket of food they insisted on bringing, because Vera Halloran was not the kind of woman who arrived anywhere without something to offer. They stayed for an afternoon and talked at the kitchen table about the farm they'd lost in the years since, and the letter that Amelia had sent them in the weeks before the courthouse hearing. And James Halloran, who was a quiet man with a farmer's hands and the particular dignity of someone who has endured a great deal without losing himself, said that the letter had been the first time in 4 years that anyone outside his family had acknowledged that what happened to them was wrong. "Not illegal yet," he said. "We knew it was wrong. We just didn't have words for it that anyone else would accept." "You have words now," Amelia said. "The federal filing has your names. Your situation is in the record." "That's something," he said. "Even if nothing else comes, that's something." It was something. She held on to that. Over the following weeks, more of the families came or wrote or sent word through intermediaries. Not all of them. Some had moved too far. Some were too cautious. Some were still in the process of understanding what the investigation meant for their specific situation, and were waiting to see. But enough came that Amelia began keeping a record of her own, not the cold accounting of a ledger, but a human document, names and stories, and the specific details of what had been taken, and what had been rebuilt, and what had not. She did not know exactly what she was building, but she knew it mattered, and she kept building it. Holt's reaction to the changed situation on the mountain was characteristically economical. He observed the transformation, the increased traffic on the road, the letters arriving and being answered, the way the house had become something different from the quiet outpost it had been when he'd first come to work for Elias for approximately 2 weeks. And then one morning at breakfast, he set down his coffee and said, "You're going to need more hands." Elias looked at him. For the ranch. For everything, Holt said. He looked at Amelia. The work you're doing, the families, the records, the correspondence, that's not something one person does alone for long before it becomes more than one person can manage. He paused. I know a woman in the lower valley. Good head for administration. Lost her own farm in '79. She's been doing piecework since then, nothing that uses what she's actually capable of. Amelia looked at him. What's her name? Ruth Calloway, Holt said. She's 52. She's not looking for charity and she won't accept it. But useful work that matters that she'd do. Tell her to come talk to me, Amelia said. Holt nodded once and picked up his coffee, and that was the end of the conversation. But 3 days later, Ruth Calloway drove up the mountain road in a small buggy with a straight back and sharp eyes, and shook Amelia's hand with the grip of someone who had been waiting for a purpose that matched her capacity. They talked for 2 hours. Ruth Calloway was hired before the second hour was out, and within a week, she had reorganized the correspondence system with an efficiency that made Amelia understand how much time she had been spending doing the wrong kind of work. You're the one who knows what matters, Ruth told her. I'm the one who makes sure the paper is in the right place so you can do the part that matters. She looked at Amelia over the desk they had set up in the second room off the main hall, the room that had been used for storage before it was needed for something better. That's how it should work. You've done this kind of work before, Amelia said. I've done every kind of work before, Ruth said in a tone that was not bitter but simply comprehensive. That's what women do when the ground shifts under them. They do whatever work is present. She opened a ledger to a fresh page. Now, tell me which of these families has the most time-sensitive situation, and we'll start there. Denny Marsh came back to the mountain once. It was late May, and he came without announcement, and he stood in the yard with his hat in his hands, and the look of a young man who had not quite finished processing what he had done and needed to put it somewhere outside himself before he could move forward. Amelia came out when she heard him arrive, and she made him sit down on the porch steps with a cup of coffee, because it was the thing you did, and she let him talk. He had left the bank. Of course he had. There was no bank left to speak of, in the sense that the investigation had frozen its operations and scattered its staff, and the building on Raven Creek's Main Street now had the shuttered look of something that had been emptied of its purpose. He had gone back to Helena and found work with a small accounting firm, legitimate work, the kind of work he'd thought he was getting into when he'd taken the bank position 3 years ago, before he understood what he was in. Do you regret it? Amelia asked, coming forward. He thought about it honestly, which she appreciated. No, he said, but I understand it differently than I did when I did it. When I walked out of that bank with those papers, I felt like I was doing a brave thing, a clear thing. Now I just feel like I did the thing that was correct, and I'm glad I did it, and I need to figure out what I do next. He looked at the mountain around them. I thought it would feel more decisive, more resolved. Most correct things don't feel resolved when you do them, she said. They just feel like the next step. The resolved feeling comes later, if it comes at all. He looked at her. Did it come for you? She thought about the morning in the courthouse. She thought about the letter from Croft on the kitchen table. She thought about her hand in Elias's hand, certain and warm. She thought about Ruth Calloway with her ledger and her efficiency and the particular satisfaction of watching the right person in the right work. It's coming, she said. It's incremental, but yes. He nodded, finished his coffee, put his hat back on. Thank you, he said, for all of it, for taking the documents, for not treating me like I was doing something extraordinary when it was really just the thing that needed doing. It was extraordinary, she said, and it needed doing. Both things are true. He shook her hand and went back to his horse and rode down the mountain road, and she watched him go with the particular warmth of someone who has seen a young person do a hard right thing and come through it with themselves intact. Why? The day Charles Whitaker was formally indicted by a federal grand jury, Raven Creek was so quiet it was almost loud. Amelia heard about it from Ruth, who had heard about it from a woman in town who had ridden up the mountain specifically to deliver the information, because some news is so significant in a place that it cannot wait for the ordinary mail. She was in the garden when Ruth came out to tell her, and she straightened up from the weeding and listened to the details and then went back to the weeding, which was not a lack of feeling, but its opposite. The feeling was too large to express in a single gesture, and the garden needed attention, and the work would help her carry it. Elias came out 20 minutes later and stood at the edge of the garden and looked at her. "You heard," she said. "Holt told me." She pulled a weed and set it aside. "It doesn't undo any of it," she said. "The families, the years, the things that were taken." She paused. "I know that." "Yes," he said. "But it means it's on the record, permanently officially in a way that can't be revised or explained away." She looked at him. "Whatever happened to us, to all of us, it's in the record now, the true version." He came into the garden. He had stopped being careful about the garden a long time ago, the way you stop being careful about a place once it belongs to you as much as it belongs to itself. And he crouched down beside her and began pulling weeds from the row she was working. They worked in the comfortable silence that had become over the months one of the most reliable things in her life. The silence of two people who have been through something together and come out the other side and have reached the place where the shared experience lives, not in what they say, but in the air between them. "I've been thinking," Elias said. "About what? About the future of this place, this property." He kept his eyes on the garden. "It's always been a ranch. That was the purpose, cattle land, the ordinary work of keeping a mountain operation running." He paused. "But it could be something else also. Not instead. In addition." She looked at him. "What are you thinking? Ruth is here. The correspondence, the records, the work with the families that has to live somewhere. It could live here." He looked up at her. "There's room. This property is larger than two people and a cattle operation need. There are buildings we don't use, space we haven't put to purpose." He met her eyes. "What you're building with the families, it needs a home. It could be here." She sat back on her heels. She had thought about it herself in the abstract, the way you think about things that are still forming. The work she was doing, the record-keeping, the correspondence, the slow, careful effort to connect the affected families with the legal process and with each other. It had been improvised from the beginning, built out of whatever was available in whatever room had space. It worked, but it worked the way temporary things work, through persistence and adjustment rather than design. "A proper office," she said slowly. "Resources. A place where people know they can come." "Yes," he said. "People would have to trust this place," she said. "Trust us." Some of them have had significant reasons not to trust anyone who presents themselves as wanting to help. "I know," he said. "That takes time, and consistency, and being here doing the work over months and years until the trust is earned." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not going anywhere. Are you?" She looked at him. The man everyone in Raven Creek had feared for 7 years. The man with the damaged leg and the scar and the 7 years of deliberate solitude that had been chosen not out of misanthropy, but out of grief, and the reasonable conclusion that the world had made its judgment, and he had decided to stop arguing with it. The man who had stood in a town square and pushed a payment into the dirt and said, "I don't own people," and meant it with every quiet certain thing in him. The man who had given her a room and wages and told her every day that she was there because she chose to be until she believed it. The man who had sat across a kitchen table from her at night and listened to her think out loud and treated her thoughts as worth engaging with. The man who had stood beside her in a courthouse and let her lead because he understood that leading was what she needed to do, and that supporting her in it was the better kind of strength. The man who had placed his hand over hers and not said anything except what he meant. "No," she said. "I'm not going anywhere." Dad. They were married in July in the garden that Catherine Caldwell Vance had planted and that Amelia had brought back to life. It was not a large ceremony. Judge Price officiated, which seemed right. Holt stood beside Elias with the expression of a man who is deeply pleased and intends to show it through the absolute minimum of visible emotion. Ruth Calloway sat in the front row, in her good dress, and watched the proceedings with the same sharp assessing attention she brought to everything. And Amelia caught her eye once during the ceremony, and saw something in her face that was warm and unguarded and real. Vera Halloran came, and 3 of the other families from the documents, and Amos Fincher and his wife and Denny Marsh had ridden down from Helena specifically for the occasion, and sat in the back row looking younger than he had any right to look for someone who had done what he'd done. Amelia wore a dress she had made herself, because making it herself was the kind of thing she had learned to do in a life where resources were limited, and she had stopped being ashamed of that long ago, and was in fact proud of it in the specific way that a person is proud of a skill that was earned rather than given. Elias wore his good coat and had shaved carefully and stood very straight despite his damaged leg, and looked at her the way he had looked at her across kitchen tables and in the garden and on the porch in the cold, with the particular quality of attention that made her feel visible in the best possible sense, not exposed, not scrutinized, but seen, fully and willingly, and without condition. Judge Price said the words. They said the words back. When Elias put the ring on her finger, a simple band gold which had been Catherine's, and which he had asked Amelia with great care whether she was comfortable wearing, and to which she had said yes without hesitation, because it was not a competition, and it was not a replacement. And Catherine had loved this land and this man, and the ring was a piece of that love continuing, rather than being supplanted. She felt the weight of it as something she had not felt before, not a claim, not a contract, not an obligation, an anchor. In the best sense of the word, something that held you in place, not by constraint, but by choice. Something that said, this is where you are. This is where you belong. You chose this, and it chose you back. You may kiss your bride, Price said, and the old man's voice had something in it that was almost humor. Elias kissed her briefly and sincerely, and the people in the garden made the sounds people make when they have been watching 2 people arrive at something they were always going to arrive at and are glad to be present for the moment it happens. Holt cleared his throat and looked at a point in the middle distance that was apparently fascinating. The summer was the best one she had ever had. She could say that simply and without qualification, which was itself remarkable. She had not before had summers she could assess that way. She had had summers that were better than others, summers with moments in them that were good summers. She was glad to have gotten through. She had not had a summer that was in its totality the best. This one was. The ranch work settled into a rhythm that included her fully and naturally, not as a guest performing usefulness, but as a person whose presence was woven into the operation. She worked the garden and managed the correspondence and met with the families who came up the road and wrote letters to the ones who didn't. And twice a week she rode down to Raven Creek and worked with Judge Price on the documentation of the estate claims, the slow, careful, legal reconstruction of what had been taken and what could be returned. The estate recovery was partial as she had expected. Some money was simply gone, moved through too many transactions to trace spent by Margaret in the years of her arrangement with Whitaker, dissolved into Harwick's operations. But some remained. Enough to matter. Enough to give the work she was doing a foundation beyond goodwill. The first check she wrote from the recovered funds went to Vera Halloran. She drove it down to Raven Creek herself and put it in Vera's hands in person, and watched the woman stand in her kitchen and look at the paper and press her lips together and not say anything for a long moment. "I don't want thanks," Amelia said. "I want you to use it." "I know how to use it," Vera said. Her voice was steady. "We've been planning what we'd do if we ever got a second chance. We have it written down." She looked at Amelia. "We'll put it toward land." "Good," Amelia said. She drove back up the mountain in the late afternoon with the particular lightness of a person who has done something right and knows it and does not need anyone else to confirm it. Elias was waiting on the porch when she came in. He looked at her face. "How did it go?" he said. "It went right," she said. "It went the way it was supposed to go." He reached out and took her hand when she came up the porch steps, and they stood there for a moment in the late summer light, not talking, looking out at the property that had once belonged to the family of a woman who had loved it, and that had been fought for, and held, and built into something new, without losing what it had always been. In September, a letter arrived from Margaret. It was the first direct communication since the courthouse steps in Raven Creek, and Amelia held it for a long moment before opening it, not from reluctance, but from the same carefulness she brought to important things. It was short. Margaret wrote that the federal proceedings were moving toward resolution. She wrote that she understood she would face consequences and had accepted that. She wrote one sentence about Thomas Amelia's father that said only, "He was a good man, and he deserved better stewardship of what he left behind. So did you." And then she wrote that she did not expect forgiveness and was not asking for it, and that she hoped Amelia was well. Amelia read it twice. She set it on the desk. She thought about what to do with it for 3 days, and then she wrote back a short letter. She did not offer forgiveness because it was not hers to offer on the terms Margaret had set, and she did not withhold it as a punishment because she was not interested in punishing anyone. She said simply that she had received the letter and that she was well, and that the work was progressing, and that she hoped Margaret, in whatever came next, found something that mattered to her to do. She sealed the letter and gave it to Holt to post and did not think about it again, because there is a difference between resolving something and setting it down. And she had learned on this mountain, in this house, in this life she had built with her own deliberate hands, that setting a thing down was often the resolution. That the work of healing was not arriving at a moment where everything was clean and complete, but building a life so full of the right things that the wrong things found less and less room to live in. She had done that. She was doing that. Every day she was doing that. On an October morning, with the aspens gone gold on the mountain, and the air carrying the first real bite of the coming winter, Amelia sat at the desk in the room that had been transformed from storage into the center of her work, and she looked at what surrounded her. The records of 14 families, now more than 14, the correspondence that came in twice weekly from the federal process, and from Judge Price, and from Croft and Helena, and from the families themselves, the letters that said thank you, and we're rebuilding, and we got the land back, and once from the youngest Callaway boy in Billings, a single page that said only, "I never thought anyone would care enough to try. You did. That matters." Ruth Callaway at the other desk, moving through the morning's letters with her efficient, unhurried focus, occasionally reading something aloud that required Amelia's attention, and otherwise simply present in the way that good colleagues are present as a reliable, steady fact of the room. Outside the window, Elias crossing the yard with Holt, the two of them moving in the easy rhythm of men who have worked alongside each other long enough that the coordination is automatic, talking about something that made Holt shake his head and made Elias almost smile. The garden past its summer peak, but still holding the last of the fall herbs, the rosemary still green against the cold, the whole bed tended and alive in the way that things are alive when someone loves them consistently over time. The mountain around and above everything, older than all of it, older than the story, older than the pain, older than the injustice, and the recovery, and the slow, patient work of making something good from what had been made wrong. The mountain did not care about any of it. The mountain simply was, which was its own form of reliability. She picked up her pen. She had a letter to write to a family in the Bitterroot Valley whose name had appeared in a new set of documents that Croft's expanded investigation had uncovered, who had lost their homestead claim in 1880, to a variation on Whitaker's scheme run by an associate in a neighboring county. They did not yet know that anyone was aware of what had happened to them. They did not yet know that the record existed, or that someone had looked at it and recognized in it the same pattern she had learned to identify in her first months on this mountain. She was going to tell them. She was going to tell them exactly what she had needed someone to tell her when she was 19 years old and standing in a town square with a suitcase and the very mistaken belief that she was worth nothing, that what happened to them was not their fault, that it was documented, that there were people who knew, that the truth had been written down and would not be erased, that standing was something they had even if no one had told them yet, that they were not alone in it. She had been sent to a mountain to disappear. She had become something the mountain could not contain. Not through drama, not through a single decisive moment, not through rescue or luck, or the intervention of any power outside herself, but through the daily accumulation of small right choices, one after another, adding up over months into something that was clear and solid and completely hers. Through the work of learning slowly and without rushing that she was not the story someone else had written about her. That the value placed on her by people who needed her to be small was not a fact about her. That she was not defined by the room she had been locked out of, but by the door she had learned to open, and through the grace of finding in a place she had not chosen, and from a man everyone had told her to be afraid of the thing that made all of it possible. Not a rescue, a witness, someone who had looked at her on the worst day of her life and seen without embellishment and without condition exactly who she was. She began to write. Outside, Elias's voice carried through the window low and certain, and she heard him laugh, a real laugh, unguarded, the kind she had come to know over months of shared meals and long evenings, and the particular intimacy of two people who have chosen each other in full knowledge of each other's weight. She paused and listened to it, and felt it in her chest, the way you feel the things that are most true about your life, quietly, completely, without needing to name them, to hold them. Then she turned back to the page. She had work to do. The family in the Bitterroot Valley was waiting to learn that someone had found them. And Amelia Whitmore Vance, the girl who had been sent away as nothing, the woman who had built a life worth more than anything that had ever been taken from her, had every intention of being the one to tell them. She wrote the first line and kept going.